Hello and welcome everyone for this talk on Mussolini and the monarchy. I'm very lucky to be joined by Marcus Furious Pertinax. Hello.
Good evening, or shall I say buonasera to our friends. Buonasera amici. Lovely to be back. And sorry for the slight mix-up for this evening. If those are wondering about the stream being down, it was my fault tonight, so I apologise. I was being typically Italian by being ill-timely, so my apologies for that, AM.
No, I'm glad that we could all solve this, and we're doing this topic because I'm not sure how well versed many of you are in 19th and 20th century Italian history, but obviously the topic of fascism and Mussolini has been extremely well trod, but not necessarily from this angle. Indeed, if you look about and find excerpts and readings from this in English regarding the monarchy's relationship to Mussolini, it's very sparse. The main source I'm using for this evening is Dennis Mack Smith's Italy and its Monarchy, which I've left cited in the description. But I guess, Marcus, I just want to ask sort of what are your general thoughts on the sort of the Italian monarchy and its role in the whole sort of scope of Italian history? Because I think, again, this speaking from the point of view of a sort of Anglophone perspective on Italian history, it very much seems that the way that one sort of imbibes elements of Italian history, it begins the Renaissance, and then you have the sort of complete sort of absence with the Eta Barocca, as Benedetto Croce would refer to it as. And then you come to perhaps elements of the Risorgimento, the Italian unification in the 1850s and 60s. And then you come to Mussolini, but the element linking the Risorgimento to Italian fascistic politics is, of course, the monarchy. It's almost impossible, at least constitutionally, if nothing else, to talk about Italian fascism without also talking about the monarchy. So I guess, what is your overall perspective on the Italian monarchy period?
A hard question to answer with any brevity, but I'll do my best. We also had a bit of a chat before we went live, and sort of Italy's quite a unique instance, compared to its immediate neighbours. And insofar as how the monarchy comes into in the context of being conjoined to a unified state, a unified Italian state in this instance, it sort of has a rather unique way of going about it. If one is to look to the west of Italy, you see, the Spanish have had a continual monarchy for several centuries, really from the early medieval period onwards. Well, maybe not as a strictly unified kingdom, but I mean, by the age of Ferdinand and Isabella, Spain is essentially a unified kingdom. France, although through various periods of unity and disunity, essentially there's a French kingdom, from the Frankish period onwards, one way or another. There's obviously a kingdom of England, either in its Anglo-Saxon form or its Plantagenet post 1066 form. And even to its east, there was, for the longest time, the Kingdom of Hungary and, what we call the Byzantine or East Roman Empire. And Italy, really, since the fall of Rome, has been a sort of decentralized and disunified, often a basket case, although often wealthy and powerful in its own ways, was a people and a geography that was very sort of I use the word disunified, although the Kingdom of Naples and the southern part of the country probably maintained a semblance of this unity, but in the from Rome and north was very different, and the way in which the modern Italian nation comes into formation and into what we understand Italy's being today. It even took even though it occurred around a similar time to which it occurred in Germany, it sort of occurred in a rather different way, definitely with much more of a revolutionary spirit, and also, how can I put this? Whether one calls it sort of fate or providence or what have you, but it obviously came to pass that the kind of people who were behind the creation of the modern Italian state, and I mean, we're going to obviously talk about Cavour, for instance. He will come to be at the forefront of this discussion at some point. And the House of Savoy happened to be the right monarchy and the right polity at the right time, with the right kind of ideological and political forces at play. And that is something you don't really see in much of what we could call like old Europe. Certainly, Europe that sits in sort of like the Romance sort of Latin speaking sphere, and that the objectives and the kind of the sort of spirit's not the right way, not the right word I want to use, but with the rise of fascism in the 20th century, it is quite apparent that there's a kind of shared vision, shall I say, with the monarchy and with the fascist movement in Italy, which probably wasn't so apparent in other parts of Europe. And it offers a unique example where in other places wasn't so apparent.
The reason, again, I'm very interested in approaching this subject, many, many reasons, is that if one looks at Italy in the 1820s and 1920s and 1930s, you have to concede that there is a diarchy. It is not simply
Indeed.
Mussolini controlling all events, as the general sort of uninformed picture would seem to indicate. And again, it is the figure of the king at the time, Vittorio Emanuele III, who was able to link the movement within the whole continuity of Italian history and Italian revolutionary foreign policy dating back to the year of its inception, 1861. There's another element also in terms of understanding the importance of looking at this from the monarchical point of view, which is often, you can say rather lazily, comparisons with Mussolini are invariably made to Adolf Hitler in Germany. And of course, in Germany, we have the very, again, well-trod understanding that Hitler won through a series of measures, one of which was Hindenburg, the then president of Germany, making him the chancellor, Hindenburg subsequently dying, and Hitler declaring that the office of head of state was vacant. Thereafter, he amalgamated the position of head of state to him as Reichschancellor and Führer. But in Italy, there is no such instance. So the Hindenburg equivalent in Italy, Vittorio Emanuele III, is responsible for appointing him, yet he is also responsible ultimately for deposing him. So throughout the entire 20 odd years of a cohabitation or diarchy between monarchy and Mussolini, ultimately, in both cases, the monarchy is responsible for elevating and ultimately deposing Mussolini. So therefore, very interesting to look at this. Anyway, I have a segment here, which is from the book I mentioned by Smith, just outlining the inception of the Italian monarchy and really building on some of the points that you've already alluded to, Marcus. In March 1861, Vittorio Emanuele II, so this would be the grandfather of the king at the time of Mussolini, at the age of 41, was proclaimed the first sovereign of United Italy. He had been a king since 1849, but only of a small region comprising Piedmont, Savoy, Sardinia. His new kingdom, in 1861, included most of the Italian peninsula, though lacking Rome, Venice, Trieste, and the area surrounding Trent, south of the Alps. He had successfully deposed and replaced his relatives who ruled in Tuscany, Naples, and Sicily. He had conquered much of central Italy from the Pope. By ceding Savoy to the French, he had won the support in taking Lombardy from the Habsburg Empire. Plebiscites had then been held in the various regions to justify their annexation and the creation of a united kingdom with the Piedmontese city of Turin as its original capital. It would eventually move briefly to Florence before settling on Rome following the conquest of that region in 1870, conquest of Lazio. And it's just important again to mention, you mentioned historic disunity. One element of this, of course, is that invariably the rise of one particular royal house of Italy involved the deposition of all the others. And this is something I really want to emphasize in comparison with, say, German unification. When Germany was unified as a federation of princes. You can almost say that Bismarck, who was the minister president and then chancellor of Germany, but also leader of Prussia, very much wanted to almost see the creation of the German Empire as a continuation of the Holy Roman Empire. It's not simply a matter of, say, for example, you look at uh, Third Reich propaganda and trying to emphasize a continuity between all the previous German empires. In this case of the transition between the first and the second, that being the Holy Roman Empire, the Heiliges Romanisches Reich, and then the Kaiserreich, there is very much a sense of, basically, you can almost say like a process of translatio imperii, the transfer of imperial power from one royal family and one power base in Germany, that being the Austrians, to the Prussians and the Hohenzollern House in Berlin. And as a result of that, in order to assuage a huge amount of, you can say, revolutionary fervor coming from the bourgeoisie, coming from leftist lawyers, focused on the city of Frankfurt as they were coalescing in 1848, the princes were very much secure, except for the ones that Bismarck basically decided to depose, like the kings of Hanover, etc. But ultimately, if you look at the King of Bavaria or you look at the King of Saxony, long-term historical rivals of the House of Prussia, they were kept in their positions and they were all able to hold on to their princely and royal titles up until the First World War. But when you come to Italy in the 1860s, in I forget the year exactly. I think it's 1830. The old branch of the House of Savoy, which is one of the oldest ruling families in Europe, it claimed to be the oldest ruling house in Europe. It claimed descent from the Etonians. That's how far back we're going, into the ancient sort of the first sort of reigning sort of dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire back in the 10th and the 11th centuries. But the House of Savoy, the mainline house, died out in the 1830s and was replaced by a junior house. You can almost say there is some analogy that can be brought between the division of the Capetian house in France, between the mainline Capetians and the Orleanists, who represented a far more liberal branding of the French monarchy effectively. Because when the new house came in, they came in under a sovereign of Piedmont called Charles Albert. He supported the Italian revolutionaries of 1848, and he was very much embarrassingly defeated. The second time round, the House of Savoy under Cavour made the wiser choice, basically, which was to allow for Italian unification under the guise, basically, of the French army. And my contention on this channel has always been that Cavour was able to successfully dupe Napoleon III into allowing for Italian unification. You can say it was the greatest single sort of piece of Italian foreign policy, perhaps in the entirety of the history of the United Italy, was Cavour being able to use the French army to unite Italy. Essentially, for the sake of what would ultimately prove to be a disastrous decision from Napoleon III, as he would have to keep garrisoning Rome to prevent the Italians from annexing it.
And also, you got to think and a way to eject the Austrians in which the Italians would have had no other way of achieving that objective.
Yes, and before then, you have to look at Italy as basically an alliance which was dominated by Austria, which controlled areas of Italy directly, like Lombardy, which is the area around Milan, and Venetia, the area around the city of Venice, territories which weren't considered part of the Italian patrimony at the time, which are now like the Trentino region and Trieste,
Bolzano, the Istria,
Bolzano, the Istria, and this was formed in alliance with other Habsburgs in Tuscany, and other Habsburg allies in Modena and Lucca. And then you had the Habsburg-aligned House of Bourbon, Bourbon Naples in the south, ruling over the quote-unquote two Sicilies, which was just the southern half of Italy, and the Kingdom of Sicily, and also an alliance with the Pope. So what's remarkable is that after the decisive French intervention in Italian politics to prop up the House of Savoy, the revolutionary House of Savoy, the junior branch of the House of Savoy, it's hard to really describe this as anything other than a series of mass usurpation and appropriation. And I'm not saying that to sound incendiary. I really do mean that, in the sense that all of these old monarchies, in the exact opposite situation we had in Germany, the rulers of Tuscany, the rulers of Naples, especially, with their glorious palaces, such as the Palace of Caserta. Caserta, for people who don't know, is actually larger than Versailles in terms of its grandeur and scope. These princes were basically chased from their thrones, and the Italian monarchy basically just pocketed all of these resources and palaces. And one of the motivations for the then king of Savoy, Vittorio Emanuele II, was to pay off his vast debts, almost inexplicable debts, because they never had a proper accounting of the palace finances until very late into the reign of Vittorio Emanuele III. So that's another sort of interesting sort of indicator of it, in the sense that it really was almost Napoleonic. I think it's fair to say, we're having this this revolutionary dynasty toppling all of these other monarchies, inspired by
Mhm.
this revolutionary fervor about the unification of the fatherland.
Indeed, you might say a sort of a grand, uh, not imperial project. Imperial's not the right word, but sort of like a grand royal project, and its first and chief aim is the toppling of all its competitors in that same area for the to unify that patrimony in that name. It's kind of there's a kind of an irony to it, isn't there?
Well, I would say actually there is credence to calling it imperial, because it wasn't just the aspirations to ruling over a country, but Italy had to be a great power was also
Mm,
a great sort of underlying assumption. One of the motivations for Italian unification, as indeed was consistent with Mussolini's foreign policy, is the idea that Italy is it is the great power of European history. It is the Roman Empire.
mm,
It is the Italian city-states that used to look on all the other monarchies of Europe as being barbarous by comparison. It was the center of the Renaissance. Ergo, Italy had to become a great power, and the only
mm.
way to achieve that was by reversing this process of segmentation, it being regarded by, say, for example, famously Metternich as nothing more than a territorial or geographical
A geographical
expression.
reference,
And we
yeah,
must instead basically turn the tide of history and realize our own version of manifest destiny. So it's not enough to
correct.
have Italian unification, but Italy must be great. And then you come up to the, Mussolini's aspiration of Mare Nostrum and
Hmm.
the Italian lake and, breaking the barriers at the
The
Suez
fourth
Canal
shore, that sort of
and
thing. Yeah,
Gibraltar
yeah,
and all that sort of thing. So I would
yeah.
say imperial, right from its inception, is very clear, especially with the idea that the capital has to be Rome.
Hmm. Eternal city. Yeah,
It's not just enough to have the capital at Turin or the capital at Naples or Milan or Florence or all of these other cities that were
they won't
suggested.
do.
They won't do. It must be Rome. It must be the capital of the Roman Empire, and it must also be the capital of the papacy. We must. Again, these are in terms of just understanding how revolutionary this all was. When Rome was eventually taken over by the Italians in 1870. Um, it ended 1,000 years of over 1,000 years of temporal rule in Italy by the Pope in Rome, in the area between Rome and Ravenna, the dispensation of Pepin, going back to, what was it, 750, all of these sort of things. So
Sometime in the mid-8th century. Yes.
yes, Napoleon, of course, had deposed the Pope as well, but in a very limited fashion when he annexed the whole area to France. But the House of Savoy were able to do it definitively up until the creation of the Lateran Treaty in 1929. But I'll just continue. Not everyone was pleased by the triumph of this second Italian Renaissance or Risorgimento. The papacy was an aggrieved party and refused to recognize the existence of unified Italy. Successive popes, together with die-hard adherents of the deposed dynasties, continued to believe or hope that the clock could be put back. Nor was a monarchist victory welcome to all Italian patriots, especially as the dynasty of Savoy had a history that was as much French as Italian, and had been slow to accept the idea of unifying the peninsula. The greatest patriot of all, Giuseppe Mazzini, would have preferred the establishment of a democratic republic. The Republicans had been the first to formulate the concept of a unified Italy and fight for it at a time when Piedmont and the House of Savoy had shown either hostility to, or at best, a very moderate interest in what seemed a utopian dream. Mazzini accepted, if with reservations, that a monarchical Italy was better than no Italy at all. One of his early disciples, General Giuseppe Garibaldi, had even been responsible for the final triumph of the monarchy when, in 1860, he led a private army of volunteers to conquer Naples and Sicily from the Bourbons. The victorious Garibaldi was the first to issue in Sicily a proclamation acclaiming Vittorio Emanuele as King of Italy. But the contribution to national unification of Garibaldi and Mazzini was depreciated and sometimes denied by the conservative monarchists, who thereafter monopolized government in Turin. The two wings of the patriotic movement, conservative anarchists on the one hand, radicals and the so-called Action Party on the other, continue to exist in an uneasy and often hostile relationship. Now, this is again very important in terms of looking at this as a way of comparison, is that we have the unease with the fact that Italian unification is basically indebted to powers beyond that of the House of Savoy. Again, but when you look at the House of Savoy, I very much look at it as a as a conniving institution, a conniving family, because they're able to play off all of these other forces who are basically willing the victory of Italian unification on its behalf, whether it be Napoleon III at the Battle of Solferino, or whether it be Giuseppe Garibaldi by his conquest of the Italian South. All of this, again, is interesting because it shows a fundamental lack of security. The Prussian monarchy was able to establish German unification with a sense of triumph. You can't say that German unification was as a result of anything other than the prowess of the German army in its final incarnation. Whereas in the case of the House of Savoy, it's very much, okay, well, we tried at Custoza, and we get terribly and embarrassingly defeated when we try and fight against the Austrians on a front which they'd never expected to win. But Garibaldi is seemingly, effortlessly coming along and conquering half of the Italian kingdom by simply landing, near Palermo, near Naples. And we have to wait until he embarrasses himself. So, for example, when he tries to take Rome in the year 1867, ultimately is defeated, the Italian monarchy basically needs to savor these moments. Oh, thank goodness, these revolutionary generals aren't infallible, so we can perhaps try and accrue some of our own gravitas and prestige to ourselves. Again, it's this contest between the revolutionary forces and the monarchy, which simply didn't exist within the context of German unification.
And just as a slight aside too, I know this might be my inner Hellenophile sort of coming to the surface very briefly, but another thing which would sort of contrast with the lack of Italian success in being able to eject the imperial powers out of Italy in this case, namely Austria, and as you say, it's largely dependent on the support of Napoleon III and the French in order to sort of bring about the nascent beginnings of a nation state and of a unified Italian kingdom, is that the success throughout the 1820s, 30s, and 40s of Balkan independence, of the ability of the Greeks and the Serbs, and later the Bulgars or Bulgarians to throw off the Ottoman yoke in the east. These small sort of revolutionary-driven independence movements in the Balkans being able to throw off a half-millennia Ottoman yoke. Meanwhile, the Italians cannot eject the Austrian Empire out of the heart of northern Italy. Just an interesting little comparison there that a number of people would miss.
And it's always sort of one of the interesting arguments I use against the tried out novelty of, oh, well, Austria was a moribund empire, Austria was doomed to destruction. Well, if that's the case, why did Italy always consistently lose against
Correct,
the Austrians and ultimately
and require extensive assistance in order to throw them out eventually?
Yes, exactly. And the final victory you have, Vittoria Veneto, is more of a propaganda victory because Austria-Hungary had ceased to exist as a state by the time at which it was fought. But anyway,
Exactly.
this is just a quick summary of what the position of the king was supposed to be, having established the fact that Italy now has a king in the form of the House of Savoy. Italy in 1861 was governed under a constitution taken unchanged from statuo that in 1848 had been reluctantly conceded by Vittorio Emanuele's father, that's Charles Albert, to his small kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia. King Charles Albert had in that year given way to pressure and surrendered his absolutist powers. His statuo was driven up in French, the language of the French of the royal court. And this, again, the fact that it is the Savoy monarchy. Savoy, of course, is now a region in France, and traditionally was a French-speaking region which belonged to the Holy Roman Empire. And the rulers of Savoy were originally the counts of Savoy, which again were originated from that patrimony. The idea that they would come and lead a revolutionary Italian kingdom at that time, really up until very recent history, is really quite interesting to consider in that sense that they were almost kind of like the Austrians, some of the least Italian of all of the Italian ruling families. His statuo was drawn up in French, the language of the royal court. It was modelled on constitutions earlier granted in France and Belgium, and was devised in a hurry, which explains why it turned out to be insufficiently precise. nor was there any provision for a constitutional court that could resolve its ambiguities and make adjustments to meet changing circumstances. The reason this is significant is that this was taken at a time of the revolutions of 1848, which swept all across Europe. But it was also written in the anticipation of that time that the House of Piedmont-Sardinia could have united Italy in the 1848 off the back of the revolutions. The exception here, of course, is that in the first instance, the first Risorgimento, the Italians lost when they were decisively defeated by the Austrians, by the octogenarian Radetzky of all people. By the Statuto, the king agreed to permit the elections of parliament and guarantee civil rights and equality before the law, but insisted that the constitution should keep as much power for the monarchy as possible. Vittorio Emanuele had the composite title of sovereign by the grace of God, as well as the dismay of other crowned heads by will of the people. That's what I mean in terms of the new House of Savoy basically amalgamating elements of the Orleanist project in France, i.e., I am the monarch by the grace of the law or the grace of the French people. I am the king of the French, or not, as opposed to, say, for example, king of the France. I am here by right of the Constitution, and I am here to take an oath on the Charter, and all of these sort of things. So effectively, the House of Savoy is alluding or trying to concede as much to the spirit of the Italian Revolution in order to confirm its supremacy over Italy, whilst also holding on to this ancient, again, Prussian comparison. I won't exchange a crown of gold for a crown of filth. Essentially, they're trying to they're trying to raise the crown of filth as if it were a crown of gold, basically by saying, well, it comes from we're still the House of Savoy, regardless of what anyone says, and we are a God-granted kingdom rather than simply a democratic kingdom.
And just for the benefit of the viewers too, it's worth keeping in mind that of all the Italian noble families, the House of Savoy were most thoroughly and by some margin the most sort of francophone of the Italian noble families by some order of magnitude. And in fact, for the longest time, the court in Turin aspired to be more French than Italian.
Well, the remarkable thing, of course, is that Vittorio Emanuele II, he's even the choice of the naming convention. In the case of the Prussian example, it's understandable. Say, for example, that Frederick would take the name Frederick III when he briefly became emperor in 1898 or 1888, I forget. But 1888, because that, of course, he's the successor of Frederick II, Frederick the Great, and of course, it is off the back of the victories of the Prussian army. So when Vittorio Emanuele takes the title the second, that in itself is very dubious, given the fact that he's trying to prove it. I'm a successor of the House of Savoy. I'm not the first king of Italy. I'm simply following on the line of my forebears. But an interesting angle regarding him is the fact that he was regarded as the most gallant gentleman king. It was, and there were various sort of odes to him in terms of this huge makeup of censorship and lèse-majesté rules. One will not insult the majesty of the king, the sacred king. We are to bow, we are to kiss the ring, we are to show all this due deference. But he hated speaking Italian. Of course, it didn't help also at the fact that we didn't have standardized Italian. The closest thing you have is the Florentine dialect, which ultimately becomes exported to all corners of Italy. But he preferred speaking in French. He hated really speaking in Piedmontese, the dialect of Italian as well. So that element of the Francophone nature of the dynasty never left them. And indeed, of course, when you go to Rome, the issue is you leave the sort of comfort and the security of Turin, you go to Rome, you basically enter a hostile city, as someone like Machiavelli would command you to do when you basically conquer a new territory. You move your capital to establish your new power base in somewhere which you are less secure in order to secure it. But ultimately, he found himself in a city whose entire aristocracy was hostile to them because they were the quote-unquote black aristocracy who supported the Vatican, and the Vatican wouldn't acknowledge. So it's remarkable, really, to consider that this stain of illegitimacy and usurpation just followed the House of Savoy everywhere they went because of this, the nature by which they came to power.
And I think that also plays into a bit of the general theme of this stream as well, insofar that I think for the German princes, there was a degree of, shall I say, admiration for the prowess by which the Prussian state and the Prussian military sort of went about, first consolidating the North German Confederation and eventually sort of unifying Germany as they did in 1871, whereas that sense of esteem and that sense of admiration is not quite so existent for the House of Savoy and the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. I think there's a dramatic difference in terms of their domestic reputation between the two, um, royal houses of each respective country.
And this, of course, will explain why the Italian king didn't have um, the powers, essentially, which were afforded to the Prussian monarch, now Emperor of Germany. By the statuo, the king agreed to permit the election of parliament and guarantee civil rights and equality before the law, but he insisted that the constitution should keep as much power for the monarchy as possible. The executive power belonged to him alone, which in theory meant that he was both head of government and head of state. Ministers were appointed and dismissed by him at will, nor could he be called into account by anyone for his actions. Indeed, to hint at his responsibility became a criminal offence. Legislative powers were shared between him and two houses of parliament, the Senate, whose members were chosen by him, and a Chamber of Deputies elected on very restricted suffrage, that being a small pool of people who could potentially elect the MPs, as well as appointing to all public offices. He kept a theoretical right to veto legislation approved by Parliament. He could authorise expenditure and then come late to Parliament to confirm any necessary taxation. In addition, he was personally commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He had authority on his own to declare wars, make peace, and arrange treaties. He did not even need to inform Parliament about a treaty, so long as he could claim that it imposed no financial burden on taxpayers, and he was permitted complete concealment if he thought it necessary for the interest of the state. As a result, these provisions basically ensured that national treaties were kept secret and wars could be begun without parliamentary consultation or agreement. One further but indefinite residual power allowed him to issue royal decrees where he thought this necessary for effective implementation by any law. Vittorio Emanuele was proud to belong to the oldest ruling dynasty in Europe. He had grown up in the autocratic traditions of his father's court and did not easily adapt to the restrictions imposed on royalty by the novel provisions of this government. Nevertheless, in his coronation oath, he swore to accept and enforce the 84 articles of the Statuo, and though he sometimes expressed dislike of Parliament, he avoided taking antagonisms too far. He had the right to dissolve the Chamber of Deputies whenever he wished, though he was obliged to call another within 4 months. And one very important limitation on his power was that by law he needed parliamentary consent for new taxes. Another limitation was that no legislation was valid without the signature of a minister alongside his own, and ministers were, unlike himself, responsible, which meant they could be called to account in Parliament. Though the Constitution made no mention of a Prime Minister or Cabinet of Ministers, he adjusted to the fact that by 1861 these had emerged as necessary institutions without which the system would not work, and with the result that Parliament gradually acquired more importance than the original creator of the Statuto, Charles Albert, had ever intended. Monarchy, as the king knew, was rendered less sacrosanct by the fact that the king himself had deposed other dynasties in the peninsula. Indeed, he was king by virtue of popular plebiscites, as well as by the grace of God, and to that extent, a hereditary throne was always seen, in one sense, as elective. So, effectively, the king has to concede to this because he is essentially there by grant of a series of interested parties who are there basically to they effectively see the House of Savoy as the lesser evil. Yes, on the one hand, the House of Savoy is deposing all of these other ruling dynasties. Yes, on the one hand, the kings are basically expressed anti-clericals, and they go around dissolving monasteries. Vittorio Emanuele II was talking about executing priests. His son Umberto would talk about castrating priests, and Vittorio Emanuele III would basically say, when he appointed Mussolini, at least we've basically been saved from the wrath of having to have a priestly government, all that sort of thing. There was a deeply embedded hatred of elements of the institutional Catholic Church. Indeed, part of the risorgimento, or the spirit behind it, was basically this idea that the secular the secular revolutionary elements of the Italian government could purify and reform the whole nature of the Catholic Church as well. So there was that element running to it. But essentially, you have a large number of very wealthy businessmen who look to Italian unification and see, okay, well, previously we had custom barriers. all of these are now broken down, so we can now effectively create our own sort of new sort of expansion of trade into all these areas which we didn't have access before. So merchants in Turin being able to extend their interests all the way to Palermo and Naples. But of course, the opposite effect was that protected industries such as farms, etc., suffered, and quintessential sort of talk: the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. But there was therefore a very wealthy, relatively anti-clerical class of Italian elites who were very interested in keeping the system together for fear of someone like a Garibaldi or for someone like a Mazzini coming in and trying to create a more revolutionary government off the back of the French Revolution, which would take all of these elements and take them that much of a step further. In France, of course, this had been tried and it was unsuccessful. If I'm going to give the Italian monarchy any sort of benefit of the doubt, I'll say it's almost remarkable that it survives for as long as it does, considering in France we have a cycle of revolutions, and every monarch basically represents a dynasty in the 19th century only to be deposed, whether it be Louis Philippe or whether it be Charles X or whether it be Napoleon III. I know I'm not using those in chronological order, but the point ultimately still stands. In the case of the House of Savoy, they're able to hold on to this coalition long enough in order to ensure the success of the system, which was essentially born out of the needs, effectively, of a dynasty holding on to this power. And another, again, a novelty of the system is that the monarchy is now very rich as a result of this usurpation and appropriation. It's twice as wealthy in terms of the civil list expenditure compared to, say, for example, the British monarchy, and it basically has all of the royal palaces, like I said, in Italy to boot. So it does very well personally as a result of this. But there's always this element, this revolutionary element, and again, the priestly element, which works against this. Leo XIII, the Pope after Pius IX, would never accept the existence of the Italian state, and only under, you can say, severe duress did Vittorio Emanuele II, the first king of Italy, receive the last rites and a temporary lifting of his excommunication before he died. So all of these elements were recurrent throughout, you can say, the entire history of the Italian monarchy. This dubious legitimacy and the fact that so many notables in Italy are basically holding on to power for the sake, basically, of saying, well, it's preferable to the alternative. And of course, you could say as you're probably far more well than I am, Marcus, the tragedy of this system, of course, is that the failure of the North to effectively govern the South essentially allows for the rise of the mafia and an entire sort of de facto decentralization and the emergence of sort of mass criminality, which of course in turn spurns on a huge amount of immigration to America and the New World.
And in turn, arguably fueled the power base for a movement which would come along in the 20th century. Ideally, that, well, in this case, one which was led by Mussolini, a force which promised to actually bring order to a place that was experiencing considerable disorder as well, which it was not getting from the central government at that time, which is a point that people often miss. It definitely just created a power base that was otherwise non-existent for the fascist movement. But as an aside, just quickly canvassing on that point about the fears and that were sort of held by certain elites in Italy, and also this disjointing between the House of Savoy and the aristocracy in the south, particularly obviously in Rome, and to a lesser point Naples as well, is that the fact that the House of Savoy on one hand is a sort of highbrow francophone, we are the oldest royal family in Europe, line of thinking and sentiment. Meanwhile, it's grafting a lot of its success, certainly domestically, on the back of Garibaldi, which was an irrefutably revolutionary force, and that the House of Savoy and sort of the machinations of Cavour, for instance, were direct beneficiaries of the success of Garibaldi in terms of him being able to essentially obliterate or rather kick in the rotten door of the House of Bourbon and the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, I think would provide more than enough sort of rational skepticism for a lot of those who opposed the House of Savoy, both domestically and also beyond the borders of Italy.
Indeed, the double fear for the House of Savoy was not just that they would be deposed perhaps by a more sort of revolutionary element in the form of, say, for example, someone like Mazzini. Mazzini, who was still alive during this process and ultimately would come back to Italy, albeit he would have to assume a new name, and he died in Pisa, I think it was in the 1870s, the 1880s. But the assumption was effectively that if Italy did not play its cards right diplomatically, it could result in the fracturing of Italy again. Almost certainly, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies would revive, perhaps the Papal States, and Italy, what was left of it, Piedmont, will basically be reduced to a rump in the north, as had basically existed in 1859 up until 1861, before the Revolutionary Kingdom was amalgamated to it. But it's interesting that you mention Garibaldi, because it's important to mention what I believe is a consistency which leads into the topic of Mussolini and the monarchy, is the idea that I think Italy basically has a consistent foreign policy throughout the entire existence of the kingdom era from 1861 up until 1843, which is to use any sort of diplomatic means necessary to hold on to territories or acquire new territories, which were consistent with the idea of Italia irredenta, unredeemed Italy. Um, the notion effectively is revolutionary, the conception that there is a ideal Italian set of borders which encompasses all of the Italian speakers, which will be latterly be taken on and accepted by German nationalists much later, following the dissolution of the Kaiserreich. But this effectively meant that there were constantly territories beyond the patrimony of the new kingdom, which were irredeemed. And this created a constant foreign policy friction, and indeed an element within the Italian public who wanted these territories to be redeemed to the Italian nation. And if you look at every king, they in part follow an element of this policy. So, for example, Vittorio Emanuele II was very concerned that following the creation of the first Italy in 1861, that there were areas of, you can say, core Italy, which we consider now, which weren't part of the kingdom. So Venice and, more importantly, Rome. And so at first, Vittorio Emanuele II is, okay, well, I need to acquire, the region of Venice. I need to defeat the Empire of Austria, who we've only recently defeated, but we only won a temporary victory because Napoleon III was only willing to grant us so much in the way of territory as compensation. And through a series, you could say, of diplomatic debacles, he was actually offered, interestingly enough, the region of Venice just to remain neutral as the Austrians went off and fought the Prussians and were ultimately defeated by the Prussians, the Battle of Königgrätz. But he decided to fight regardless. And in that short, brief period, even though the Austrians were soundly defeated by the Prussians, the Austrians were able to inflict 2 defeats, 1 naval and 1 military, on the Italians. And they were only basically able to acquire the region of Venice due to the direct intercession of the French, yet again. By which the Austrians would hand over Venice to the French, and then the French would basically cede it to the House of Savoy. The reason they did that, yes, the reason they did that was that the Austrians at the time so despised the upstart Savoyards that they would not countenance surrendering any territory directly to the Italian kingdom. So, Napoleon III, oh well, he's a more honourable, ruler of the first rank, and a Catholic who's still in communion with the church. We will cede this territory to him, and he can do what he wants with it, and basically give it over to the Italians. But the same is true for Rome, because the issue with Rome is that whilst Rome does not remain part of the whole Italian project, the revolutionary element is dead set. Rome is the capital of the Roman Empire. Rome represents the zenith of Italian power historically. It is the capital of of neoclassicism. It is all of the sort of hopes of Italy assuming the ranks of great powers, not simply of Italian unification, are based around the idea of the redemption of the city of Rome. However, if the revolutionaries get to Rome first, it could instigate this whole idea, well, whilst we're in Rome is a revolutionary capital, we are going to declare a constituent assembly. We are going to have the equivalent of a French Revolution. We'll start in Rome and we'll use this revolutionary impetus to depose the House of Savoy or what have you. So the Italian monarchy is placed in this bizarre situation where they realize, okay, well, we need to forestall this. We need to ensure that we get to Rome before the Italian revolutionaries do so. Yet at the same time, they've already damaged their relationship with the papacy enough, and of course, it'll just create an even more febrile situation. But ultimately, they're able to achieve it despite a military defeat in 1867. Again, as a result, basically, of the caprice of politics, when the French are defeated by the by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War. The French leave their garrison at Rome, and the Italians are able to occupy it, and it was basically a bloodless coup of that region. And basically, they're able to forestall that potential complication in the relationship between the revolutionaries and the monarchists. But this is a continuous thing. This idea that the revolutionary element is there, we need to redeem Italy, and the monarchy is happy to go along with it so long as they're able to gain territory. But there always exists the threat that if the monarchy isn't able to play off these forces, they will themselves be subsumed by a greater, you could say, more nationalistic threat. And this continues. You can see this, say, for example, with the city of Fiume after World War One. I'm going a bit further, where Gabriele D'Annunzio seizes control of that territory, but then ultimately the government needs to shut his insurrection down, but also claim Fiume for the Italian state at the same time. So
Yeah.
this, yeah.
Denounce the men who undertook the operation, but then benefit from its goals and achievements. Yeah,
Yes, basically.
there's a fair bit of that happens.
Yes, basically. I mean, the ideal formula for this series of expansion was basically for these revolutionaries to start off and take these territories without the complicit consent of the government authorities. They can seem to have plausible deniability, and hopefully they would then immediately die of their own accord, so that the Italian government doesn't need to deal with the repercussions. That's effectively how cynical the whole process of Italian expansion was. And I mentioned to Marcus, but the more you read into this and the more consistent this becomes a feature of Italian foreign policy, I almost look at the House of Savoy as one of the most bellicose and duplicitous royal families that have ever ruled a major state in Europe for this exact reason. I mean, just to name an example, the King of Italy, the first King of Italy I mentioned, Vittorio Emanuele II, he was prepared to declare war on Germany for the sake of aiding France, just so he could get Nice and Savoy back. And the only reason he didn't was because his ministers, who were thankfully much more intelligent than he was, realized that the Prussians would probably win. And they basically forestalled and tried to sort of just distract the king long enough until the Battle of Sedan happened and Napoleon III was captured, just so Italy didn't land itself in that situation. And this, by the way, was during a period in which the Germans and the Italians were seen as allies as well. So it was very
had
clear.
cooperated against Austria
and had just cooperated against Austria a few years prior. So again, this idea is that Italy was prepared to declare war on erstwhile allies at a moment's notice in order to gain some sliver of territory in the case of Nice, but this is a consistent feature. Of course,
as we sometimes hear in our circles, they're not beating the reputation, or they're not beating the accusations. The Italian monarchy in this instance.
And of course, sometimes it goes well, as we mentioned, but sometimes it goes disastrously. One example is that Umberto, the successor of Vittorio Emanuele II, who very much follows in this example, basically of following the irredentist foreign policy, wants to establish an empire in Italy. He acquires the territories of Eritrea and Somalia, and then effectively contrives a means to create a protectorate kingdom in Ethiopia. The Ethiopians find out about this and say, no, we're not prepared to be your protectorate, and they go to war under Emperor Menelik. And in a repeat of what the British found at Islandawala, the Italians were defeated at the Battle of Adowa, which was a tremendous defeat for the Italian state and the Italian monarchy. And Umberto comes out and declares, I'm effectively I am what they call a warmonger, I believe were his official terms. I do not want to pacify the, to come back from the situation. I want to go back and I want to conquer it. So that's another element of the unredeemed legacy. The fact that when Mussolini is following off with his Abyssinian policy in 1935, 1936, he's actually following the tried and true tested ways of his royal predecessors in the form of Umberto. That this was actually Italian royal policy, which had the backing of figures like Crispi, which was prime minister at that time, who had to resign, and Perot, who would have to deal with the the militarization and the putting down of popular discontent after the disaster. And ultimately, this leads to a situation where the king himself is assassinated in the year 1900. And again, I mentioned the idea of how remarkable it seems that the House of Savoy is able, despite this incredibly precarious situation that we're describing, is able to survive. Because something happens in Portugal which is very similar to what happens in Italy at the same time, and the Portuguese monarchy does not survive. For people who don't know, because they haven't seen the conversation I had with Panama Hat on the Estado Novo, and I believe it was Hitman on the Estado Novo stream, the Portuguese had aspirations for a colony in what would nowadays be modern-day Zambia and Zimbabwe, to link the colonies of Angola and Mozambique together. These were denied, the so-called Pink Plan. The king of Portugal was then assassinated in 1908 and replaced by his son Manuel, who was himself deposed, and a Portuguese republic was declared. So again, it's very clear that this idea of deposition and we need to maintain a series of glories, or Italy needs to be seen to be on the right side, is a consistent feature. And it's that atmosphere in which the king, which Mussolini will have to deal with, Vittorio Emanuele III, comes into power. And the reason, again, I was emphasizing so much the nature of the Italian constitution is the role, effectively, which the Italian king effectively presented himself or saw his role in. And this is a assessment of him by one of his ministers at the time, Ferdinando Martini, when he became king, Vittorio Emanuele III. He does not believe in monarchy, or at least has no confidence in the future of monarchies in general. If he were not a king, he would be a republican, perhaps even a socialist. He is intelligent and cultured, but by failing to believe in his own powers, he is losing them. Today, no one seems to bother about him, or know what his opinion is, or what policy should be at this grave moment. If anyone thinks of him at all, it is to be sorry that he does nothing and remains almost in hiding. And that's something which is going to come back when we talk about Mussolini. But essentially, again, it's this habitual fear that the Italian monarchy has, that at any point it's going to be overthrown. And the criticism, effectively, the implicit criticism of Umberto by Vittorio Emanuele III is that Umberto overexerted himself when it came, for example, to involving himself too heavily in Adowa, all the persecutions that followed. And so it is better to have a king who reigns that does not govern, because if the king is seen to govern too much, the king invariably becomes involved in factionalism. And if the faction the king does not support wins, invariably, that'll mean the king will be seen to be responsible. And that simply cannot happen. Because, like I said, despite the ignominious circumstances in which the Italian monarchy comes about, it is still venerated by the notions of lèse-majesté. The king can do no wrong. Only the ministers are always at fault. It is never the fault of the king, it's always the fault of the ministers. And yet the Italian monarchy is still stuck in the situation where it has to actively guide events and has basically a controlling influence over foreign policy. So it has far less plausible deniability than, say, for example, the British monarchy, which by this time had effectively abdicated in all but, the very minor areas of interest of the states, as the reign of Queen Victoria.
The other thing that just came to mind as well is that that quotation by Bismarck, where he talked about the three pillars of, I can't remember the exact phraseology, not success in Germany, but something to that effect. And one of them is peace with Russia, and I can't remember what the second one was. But his first principles had the absolute isolation of the monarch, and that works both ways. One, the isolation of the monarch in that, insofar as it's possible to have the monarch above criticism, above public criticism and criticism for the direction and actions of the state and the state apparatus and the government and its advisors and so on and so forth. And also in Bismarck's particular case, the ability for him himself to have advised, the king as he did, or rather the emperor as he did in Germany. But that works both ways. And I think in this case, it's very much true as the latter part of that principle, whereby the isolation of the monarch from that criticism, and to not have the monarchy being sort of disparaged or stained by the actions of the government, which in the case of the House of Savoy was not an easy thing to do.
Well, also the practical interest that the Bismarck and the Chancellorship had no interest in the monarchy countermanding any of their orders. Bismarck basically had to create this a whole web of intrigue and positions where he was simultaneously the minister president of Prussia. He was the foreign minister of both Prussia and Germany, and had all of these other roles. There were cartoons at the time that basically mocked his assemblage of all of these different positions and acquisitions of new royal titles. But
Indeed.
if we're going to look at a comparison, as we see the monarchy by the time of the First World War, I think you brought up the German comparison. That's a very apt example because Italy seems to be halfway between Britain and Germany, but in a
Correct.
way, it seems to be more dysfunctional than both. The
I
reason it
was going
seems
to say halfway between both and less effective than either.
less effective than either, yes, that's a good way of putting it. And the reason is effectively is that in Germany, the chancellorship and later the army will effectively exist as a means to allow for the king emperor to avoid responsibility. In Britain, Parliament is the institution which allows for the king to avoid responsibility. But in Italy, such an institution does not exist because the Italian parliamentary structure is so volatile, and there isn't a ministerial position which is strong enough basically to compensate with that, like we see with the chancellorship in Germany. So instead, it's also important to note that Italy never developed a strong party system. Even today, I think it's fair to say that that is an endemic feature of Italian politics, that perhaps only the fascist party is the one party that was able to basically dominate Italy as a party, rather than basically through this combination of various coalition groups and gerrymandering and all this sort of thing. And there was a very cynical remark put forward by the first king of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele II, that the only way the Italians can be governed is by the bayonet and bribery. And if you look at, and again, it should sort of emphasize how utterly cynical all of these sort of Italian kings were. I mean, of the various sort of off-remarked comments about Vittorio Emanuele III, he spoke English as a first language due to the way he was brought up, but obviously spoke Italian. He was incredibly well read in history, especially military history. It's perhaps this element, of course, which allowed them to have some form of friendship with Mussolini, or at least deference towards him. And the fact they were both drinking from the same sort of academic well, so to speak. But he was seen as intelligent, but he was basically seen, as I mentioned in the first element, the idea of his deference towards republicanism or perhaps socialism, the idea that the king was completely cynical and without any sort of hard positions or sort of any sort of qualifying principles. And so the concern was simply about the preservation of the dynasty rather than for any high-minded notion above that of the existence and the continuation of the dynasty, which is why I think it's a mockery in the sense that the dynasty presented itself as a sacred monarchy, a republican monarchy, a popular monarchy, in spite of the fact, again, like I said, there was this it's actually in Italian, I believe it's the dissidio, the dissolution of relationships between the Catholic Church, of which the king is nominally a member, and over which a vast majority of the subjects are adherents to. So the idea effectively that Italy exists as a, an excommunicate kingdom, denied salvation, which pretends again to be sacrosanct. All of these contradictory elements. So I think the only sort of salvation that someone like Vittorio Emanuele has in this early period, following from the repression of his father, he dies. Luckily, there isn't this great Republican revival as we see contemporaneously happen in Portugal, but instead there is one man, Giolitti, who is able to hold together a parliamentary cabal together through, you could say, I mentioned before, the use effectively of gerrymandering, using these very small constituencies with very limited franchises, basically to bribe them and give them ministerial positions. And it's something which the king very much believed in bringing people into the government of all various stripes, whether they be, socialists or centre leftists. Invariably, there were many leftist members of the government simply because the king believed the minute you gave them an institutional position, they would become far more moderate and they would basically reconcile themselves to the whole nature of the government. And of course, as we know, that consistently does work. But that effectively was the king's tactic. And allowing for someone like a Giolitti to come forth, who basically dominated Italian politics throughout the pre-war period, so from 1900 until 1914, I believe he was prime minister 5 times, basically allows the king to find that way of escaping responsibility. Oh, I don't have to govern, I don't have to worry about imperiling the dynasty because I have this effective political tool in the form of Giolitti, even if he doesn't necessarily govern according to my direct wants and aspirations. I don't have any firm principles, so it doesn't really matter that much. Again, I'm sorry if I read this sort of very cynically, but it does.
In a sense, it's like it's almost if again, to use an adage that is in use in our circles, the system is what it does, and it's almost as if the Italians have this sort of polity that is intentionally labyrinthine, in order to be able to achieve that.
Yes, and the exception to this is foreign policy, because as I've alluded to, um, the parliamentary institutions and were never basically given control over foreign policy, unlike, say, for what we see with the British cabinet in the run up to World War One. And this means, if, say, for example, you look to the Italian declaration of war against Turkey in 1911 to conquer Libya and the Dodecanese Islands, that is very much done under the auspices of the king, far more so than done under the auspices of the prime minister. And again, it should also be noted in terms of my contention that so much of the foreign policy of the House of Savoy relied on intentional duplicity. Um, this was done despite Italy effectively, in a more serious way than Germany will be held to account when it invades Belgium in 1914. Italy was a guarantee to the territorial integrity of the Turkish Empire. And so the way it got around this was that Vittorio Emanuele basically explained that if we had not done this, oh, well, the British would have taken Libya, or the French would have taken Libya. And again, this was some, you can say, territorial reprieve for the fact that the Italians had lost Adwa. They had been chased out of Ethiopia. They'd been limited with Eritrea and Somalia. And of all
And
the yeah.
and also, never mind too that the Italians were, to put it lightly, dismayed that the French had snuck their way into Tunisia as well, which had a far larger Italian population than a French one at the time.
Yes, there was a very large expat community of Italians who had migrated towards Tunisia, and that would only actually grow during the period of French control.
Indeed.
Tunis and Bizerte in the north were considered to be vital to Italian interests, and that was always a bone of contention which exists between France. In addition to having the argument that Corsica was originally Italian because it was originally a Genoese possession, the idea that Nice was the birthplace of Garibaldi, Savoy was the original base of the dynasty. Now we also have to add to that Tunisia. And indeed, you combine this to the whole Roman notions of, a Neo-Carthage and control over the central Mediterranean, if anything like that. The French were inveigling upon this position in the sense that the British and the French also had interests in East Africa. The French had Djibouti and the British had Somaliland. So even within their own sphere of influence, that was complicated by the fact that they were sharing power always with the French and the British. But nevertheless, the king is able to incite this situation in Libya, which contravenes the alliance he has with Germany and Austria, the Triple Alliance, so-called. And the reason the Triple Alliance existed, it existed back in the time of his father, Umberto. It was basically allowed for the de-escalation of frontier conflicts over the Italian-speaking populations in Austria, but more or less you can say it was a German contrivance rather than an Italian contrivance. But this is an odd situation because by the time you get to World War One, the Italian monarchy is basically saying, okay, well, we still have these aspirations towards greater expansion. On the one hand, against France, we want Nice, we want Corsica, we want Tunisia, we want Savoy. But against the Austrians, we want Trieste, we want the Trentino, we want Dalmatia, we want Montenegro. We want to establish ourselves as the only power to exist in the Adriatic. But
and potentially dominion over Albania, which means conflict with Greece, and Greece was pro-British, etc., etc.
And Albania at that time was basically seen as a Austro-German protectorate.
Exactly. Yeah.
So again, we have this notion of which side is Italy going to join? Well, you would have thought, wouldn't you, that they would have joined with the Germans and the Austrians because they were allied to them at that time. But in a traditional fashion, the Italians did not go to war. Based on a reading of the alliance treaty. And again, it was very convenient that because the king was directly responsible for the nature of the whole treaties, that these barely had any sort of form of parliamentary scrutiny. So the king was basically thinking, okay, well, maybe I'll join in with the Germans when it looks like they're going to win in August of 1914. And then the Battle of the Marne happens, where the French are able to defeat the Germans, and the king's like, "No, I'm going to back out of this now. I don't think I'm going to join." And then later in 1915,
changing his mind.
Yes, then you have Gallipoli, and it looks like, oh look, the Turkish Empire is about to be defeated. Oh, we need to join in order to gain all these territories at the expense of the Turks. Once the Turkish Empire falls, the Russians are in Galicia. They're going to collapse Austria, and the Italians are going to be left out.
And the Russians were also eating away at the Kars Oblast and eating into the eastern provinces of the Ottoman
Yes.
Empire as well.
Yes, now's the time. If Italy doesn't join now, we'll be left with no territories whatsoever. On the one hand, they're negotiating with the Austrians, saying, "Oh well, please give us these territories, and we'll join on your side." And they're of course negotiating with the Allies the Treaty of London, which gives them all of these territories, and Albania and Dalmatia and Trentino and all of these areas of interest, which I've just outlined. If you join us. And there was this bizarre situation where in May of 1915, there was an alliance formed between the Entente and Italy, while simultaneously Italy is allied with the Central Powers as well.
Absolute diplomatic cinema.
Yes, absolute diplomatic cinema. And what makes it worse, effectively, is by way of the nature of the Treaty of London, the king has to have it ratified towards Parliament. So it's now being made public as well. So the king basically has to act decisively, on one side or the other, and he decides ultimately, very much on his own sort of personal initiative, to decide with the Entente powers against the Central Powers. And this proves out to be a disastrous decision because Italy is not prepared to go to war. Italy did not even know which side they were going to fight because they were allied to both sides, basically, at the declaration of the conflict. And it was a misreading of the conflict, effectively, that they would quickly win. They were basically joining the winning side. And the reason I'm bringing all this up to talk about the character of Vittorio Emanuele III, doesn't this remind you of something? doesn't this all remind you of something? We talk about Mussolini being uniquely culpable basically for that decision, but the more I read into it, the more I see all of these interesting continuities between Italian foreign policy.
And one could argue too that in the time which followed, Mussolini was arguably less duplicitous and more explicit in how he actually lent one way or another. Whereas the king in the lead up to World War I was very much had a foot on either side of the fence between the two grand alliances.
Yes, effectively, as I mentioned, it seemed that the superpower of the House of Savoy was their ability to dissemble. And perhaps as a result of this disaster, which basically leads at the following the loss of Caporetto to the occupation of much of northeastern Italy by the Germans and the Austrians, the king basically stays at the front. And one interpretation of this is that the king is almost doing exactly what Nicholas I of Russia did, in the sense that Nicholas I of Russia joined the front at Stavka, leaving the affairs of the country to his wife. Well, effectively, the king does the same. And one of the express purposes of this was that he didn't basically have to deal with the implications of governing, because he hated court ceremony. And again, this is an interesting fact of all of the sort of the monarchs of the House of Savoy, is that they seem to be inept when it came to the basic protocols or the expectations, the social aspects of being able to govern, being able to represent business abroad, being able to even do basic things like receive foreign ambassadors once they were presented at the Quirinial Palace in order to show their credentials and things like that. So the king, the soldier king, or the little saber, as Queen Elena of Montenegro would refer to as, the whole notion essentially is that he was able to present to the Italian people as the king, suffering the trials and tribulations at the front. But of course, that ultimately meant that he fared in basically whether the Italian army did well or did badly. And so he stayed at the front until the Italians were able to win their quote unquote victory, which was the victory of Vittorio Veneto, which was one at the point where Austria-Hungary had ceased to exist as a state. Vittorio Veneto, I believe, was won on November the 4th of 1918, November the 3rd, 1918, and Austria-Hungary had the Ausgleich had terminated on the 30th of October, 1918. But nevertheless, the king believed that the armistice, when it did happen,
the death, as one might say.
Yes, he believed that the armistice was premature. His actual desire was to go off and to invade Germany, so that the Italians could basically have more sort of bargaining power when it came to the ultimate peace treaties. And my my belief has always been that the Italians actually did very, very well out of World War One, considering the fact that Salandra, the prime minister at the time who fought under Vittorio Emanuele II for the first half of the war, believed he was fighting a concurrent war. He did not believe he was fighting a united war with the Entente powers. They were fighting a war explicitly against Austria, and indeed they weren't prepared to declare war on Germany until, I believe, 14 months after the declaration of war on Austria at the same time. So there was very little in terms of an attempt basically to pool all the resources of Italy and of the powers until it became very obvious that Italy would perhaps even lose the war had they not relied, say, for example, more on the expertise of the French and the British. And again, it's one of these remarkable moments that you look at the situation. It's very easy to say in hindsight, oh, World War One, isn't it a horrible thing? But I always look at May of 1915. I look at Vittorio Emanuele III, and I wonder, you went into war knowing what it looked like, and I always find that completely sort of remarkable. The Turks, of course, did it a few months later as well. But with the Italians, you basically had a situation where you had the stabilization of trench warfare. I believe this is around the time where we see the first use of poison gas, and yet they voluntarily opt into joining the meat grinder of the First World War for ultimately very duplicitous aims, and ultimately at the wrong time, so as to ensure maximum numbers of Italian casualties that would almost guarantee to create a political crisis if Italy didn't come back and deliver to its people unrealistic expectations of gains, which is
This is
ultimately what
just
happened.
yeah. This is a point on that as well, and let's not sort of to those who are not particularly well understanding of sort of military tactics and military history of this period, is that you mentioned trench warfare, and at this point in time there's a very large sort of disparity between sort of offensive and defensive power, and this is why we see the prevalence of trench warfare in World War One. You can trench machine guns and heavy artillery, and mass usage of troops against very sort of in very concentrated positions along a front line. You have all this technology, and fighting in the Alps means you can't dig trenches. So there's all of this firepower and essentially killing power, albeit at a slightly smaller scale, because fighting in the mountains is logistically difficult. But one is fighting in these conditions without the ability to entrench themselves. Also, the Italian army, probably even more so than compared to World War II, even was badly equipped and relatively not well led. Against the Austro-Hungarian army, or an Austrian army, if you want to say it that way, which had a fairly outstanding military tradition for at least half a millennia, and the consequence of that were quite dire. We see in over a dozen battles of the Isonzo, for instance, to the point where its commander Luigi Cardona is in fact seen as a person he's basically vilified by the end of the war.
I mean, Cardano in particular is known for haplessly executing his own men in the belief that it would basically instill morale, as if it were basically an Italian version of what's his name, Schöner, in the Courland pocket that we basically see in World War
Ferdinand
II.
Schöner, yeah.
And
And to the point where, sorry, just to say that Cardona was actually referred to as a butcher by his own men during his lifetime. It wasn't just an epithet that was put on his name afterwards.
And with great reluctance, he was bestowed the title of Marshal of Italy, basically to ape off the success of the three marshals of France. But again, this plays into the whole notion of the role of the monarchy as well, because as I've outlined, the monarchy was technically the supreme head of the army, in the sense that the monarchy also controlled foreign policy. It was the control of the army. And
Correct.
the king, even during, as we'll talk about during World War II, was unwilling to renounce his prerogatives in that area, which meant there was a huge amount of confusion because the king was not a great strategic mind, and the king was not willing, basically, to concede enough deference to one commander. And it's basically seen that Codorno held his rank for so long because he was a darling of the royal court, more than for any sort of act of great competence. Indeed, another fear.
Essentially, he was a royal toady in many ways.
There was another figure that could have potentially taken over from Codorno, who was the Duke Amadeo of Aosta. And the reason that the king refused to give his cousin that rank was he believed that he would come back and depose him. So there was another um, aspect to which, as well, the king was always concerned about holding on to his prerogatives and essentially giving it to a man who had a claim on the throne. Even though we see in the history of the British monarchy, where it became very commonly accepted practice, as we see with the German princes in World War I as well, to give high rank basically to various princes, whether it be a crown prince Luitprand of Bavaria or whatever. That situation was not repeated in Italy for the obsessive concern about the continuation of the dynasty. How would you pronounce Aosta? Someone is critiquing me in the
Myself,
yeah.
I've always said Aosta myself.
Okay.
I don't know how else you'd pronounce it differently,
I'm
unless you have enough flair on the last A at the end, Aosta. But yeah,
But it's
Aosta.
also basically a French-speaking region as well. It's a valley in the northwest of Italy, just south of Savoy, which is home of
So
a
you're just
cadet.
slightly south and slightly east of,
Yes,
yeah.
a cadet branch of the family. Basically, it goes back. But so it's in that situation, like I've said, we create an environment where the king and the Italian sort of revolutionary fervor and the whole nature of the entry in the war is opportunistic, and it's done for the sake of expansion at the expense of the Austrians. So there is this expectation that despite Italy's ultimately very limited role, and you can say ephemeral role in terms of the quote unquote victory it achieves at the end, it has these expectations of gains, but ultimately it does gain. It does gain significantly. It gains a very strong frontier in the north against Austria by taking over the Trentino region and taking over the city of Trieste, as we mentioned,
Hmm.
borders which are now larger than the modern day Italy.
Or,
However,
or
it
they
does
take the entirety of the littoral history as well.
parts of the Carniola, the
Hmm.
Austrian Carniola, and the reason this is seen as not enough is the anticipation that the Italians were going to gain more. They were going to gain control over at least the Dalmatian islands, if not the Dalmatian mainland. And again, the more you look into this, you have to sort of blame this partly on the Italians, because as we see, unlike other countries which had unified foreign policies, the whole nature of the diverse and fragmented elements of the civilian government and the royal government meant that various ministers, ultimately under the auspices of Prime Minister Orlando, went to the Paris peace conferences without a clear intention of what their ultimate gains were, even though they had some vague understanding of what they would emerge as a result of the Treaty of London. But then you have someone like Woodrow Wilson coming in and saying we're going to redraw the map of Europe based on the principles of self-determination. And by that very metric, the Italians do very well because there's a huge German-speaking region in the areas that they basically hold on to, which is a
Hmm.
problem that exists even to today, to the point the Italian
True, true.
government has finally conceded that point and offered grants of autonomy to those
Hmm.
German-speaking regions within Italy, but they're not prepared to extend the same courtesy towards Dalmatia as well and Albania. And
Just as
yeah,
an aside, just briefly, I was going to say that as a dramatic contrast to the Italian situation, going to the peace negotiations with a rather disjointed view of what the Italian state would either be owed, or what they felt they deserved, or what they felt constituted a logical and rational set of demands. You have someone like Venizelos, for instance, who basically said, "This is, mega Hellas. This is the Megali idea. This is what we envision Greece to be," and the Greek contingent at Versailles, via the Italians, have a very, very clear and a well-defined notion of what Greece post-war would look like, compared to the Italians, who really just had a mishmash of different ideas sort of congealed together in a very haphazard way.
and to give Venizelos even more credit, he was acting under the same limitations, i.e., a monarchy that was by and large hostile to him and his foreign policy at the same time.
Correct.
So, like I said, you can ultimately blame this to an extent on the Italians, but the effect of all of these demobilized soldiers coming home, and you also have to bear in mind that if Italy construed Austria-Hungary as their great historical enemy, Austria-Hungary no longer exists. The Balkans has been divided into smaller nations, all of which will basically be now fair game for Italian encroachment of soft power and ultimately influence, which is the design of things like the Pact of Rome that we later see between Austria and Hungary and Italy, and Italian influence in Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and to a lesser extent in Greece. All of these things are to say that in pure objective terms, the Italians have actually done remarkably well, perhaps even better than the French out of World War One, because
Indeed,
the French weren't able to dissolve Germany in the same way the Italians were able to dissolve Austria-Hungary.
you've read my mind. Exactly my point is that also never mind the fringe territories of Austria-Hungary, which was sort of, sheared away from the greater part of the empire of the Austro-Hungarian domain per se, but the actual heartland of what was Austria-Hungary, Bohemia, for instance, one day Czechia, Slovakia, and the Hungarian hinterlands. Obviously, Hungary and Austria were forcibly split. These core territories of Austria-Hungary are split apart from one another, and therefore what remains of Austria is simply the German-speaking ethnic German core of Austria, shorn of all the territories that actually made it an imperial power, in continental Europe for half a millennia. I mean, the scale of that can't be understated.
And yet, despite all of this that we've mentioned, again, it's just a credit to the whole febrile nature of Italian politics. Such is the state of all the conception of the mutilated victory. I've already mentioned Fiume. Fiume was basically, again, this continuing aspect of the irredeemed provinces of Italy. Fiume was created, like we see with Danzig in the Baltic coast, which was a German city that was basically protected by Poland.
A League of Nation mandate of
a League of
sorts.
Nations mandate. Fiume was basically the first of these regions to be acquired by the Italians by the same means that, say, for example, Garibaldi was able to take over Palermo and Naples in the same way he had attempted and failed with the example of Rome. But ultimately, the government under Giolitti, who comes back for a brief stint in power between 1920 and 21, deals with this quote-unquote uprising, albeit it's done in concurrence with the aims of the Italian irredentism very harshly. And thereafter, Gabriele D'Annunzio sort of becomes, you can almost say, a sort of a radical leftist, and he's seen as a proto-Mussolini in the sense that Mussolini basically carries on in the mold of essentially what D'Annunzio ought to have fulfilled as kind of like a modern-day Garibaldi in that sense. Is that fair to say?
Not too far from. I have to say, I'm not too sure where you'd see him as, or categorizing him as a leftist as such, but I'll be interested to see where that goes. Just before we continue, just for for sake of those watching, if you weren't sure where Fiume is, it's the modern day Croatian city of Rijeka, which is it is just to the east of the Istrian Peninsula at the very top of the Adriatic.
Well, I mean, all sort of just look at the controversies of fascism, for example. The four leaders of the March on Rome. One is Bianchi, who dies relatively early into the regime, but he is a syndicalist. So
True,
he is
yes.
he is again, giving all power to the workers in terms of being able to control effectively the whole nature of control over the means of production in a way which doesn't sort of reach as far as full communism.
Indeed.
Then you have someone like Italo Balbo.
I was just going to say, and they represent the working class support base of what was the early fascist movement, obviously.
Yes, and then you look at someone like Italo Balbo, and he is an avowed Republican. And then you look at figures like De Bono, who are hard monarchists, who will ultimately go against Mussolini with the vote of the Grand Council of Fascism in 1943, and will ultimately be executed for it. So again, when we're looking at the whole right-wing reaction to the sort of socialist anarchy, or the sort of the red years that follow from you could say, the collapse of morale in the government following from World War One, it's very clear that there is a vast diffusion of which D'Annunzio represents elements of this, but of course ultimately he's superseded by the effective organizer of Mussolini. And as you know, Marcus, Mussolini begins as a socialist. He's a socialist journalist, mainly operating out of Switzerland, joins the front, suffers this great injury, becomes convinced to the cause of Italian nationalism, and
absorbs the wider trauma of his peers, because I mean, essentially any Italian soldier who fought through the Isonzo campaign basically went home traumatized one way or another.
So the king is basically confronted with this new era, and Giolitti, unlike what we see in the previous years before the war, is not able to hold a coalition together which is seen as conducive to be able to hold order as a result of all of these demobilized soldiers, many of which become red guards, but many of which become part of Mussolini's black shirts, which are the fascist militia, which basically act in, you can almost say, a proxy war going between
say
these two.
they form the squadristas, they're called.
Yes, so squadristas, they are not proxy war, but a low intensity conflict which is simmering
Mm,
throughout Italy. And of course,
mm,
if we look to the whole basis of the monarchy and say, well, the monarchy is there to hold up a certain social order, is there basically to hold up a certain class. Giolitti was useful because he was seen as, he was a centrist in the way that, say, for example, he is conducive with the aspirations of the bourgeois as a political and as a financial class, but in the sense that, well, he now has to deal with all of these other elements which are accruing and demanding power. And one concession is made through one of his prime ministers, Nitti, which is to change the constitution and turn Italy into, you can basically say, the prototype for what it is today, which is to get rid of these small constituencies based on very easy to gerrymander and bribe these parliamentarians, and instead create a proportional representation state dominated by parties. But of course, as we know today, all this does is basically enable the socialists to consolidate and establish quite a large presence in the new Italian parliament in the late 1919, 1920. I think they established like 20% of the seats in this new parliament. So it seems that rather than solving the problem, it seems to exacerbate it, because the Italian prime ministers still need to be able to create all these coalitions out of these seemingly irredeemable forces all put together. And this is where Mussolini comes into the picture. But just before I read the next segment from Smith, is there anything you want to say?
No, not really. The only thing I would like to do is Max Cataphat. The thing about the thing about mispronunciation. He was talking about himself. And the other thing he said was that good to see my least favorite topic being discussed. No offense to you, Furious. No offense taken. So I hope you're enjoying the show anyway. So continue.
Well, just on that topic, from a monarchist point of view, I think it's actually very important to dissect this period of history, because it seems that all of the incongruencies of what represents monarchy in general are epitomized by the House of Savoy, in more
And I
ways than
agree with
one.
you there, actually. That's even something that I myself have missed as someone who's relatively sort of understanding of the subject. I didn't actually see it from that frame. It was actually a bit of a learning experience for me to sort of, think of it through that frame of reference. So I agree.
Vittorio Emanuele, I'll just refer to him as the king from now on, disapproved of Mussolini's criminality, but appreciated that the fascists claimed to be good patriots, and was reported as saying to General Giardino, perhaps in jest, that he would not have been sorry if their irregular black-shirt militia had acted forcibly against the Reds, who sometimes staged noisy demonstrations outside the Quirinal Palace. The palace, by the way, was the former residence of the popes before they reduced themselves by moving into the apostolic palace. So again, in the sense I talked about the House of Savoy squatting, that's an element which is also another bone of contention with the Vatican. Mussolini continued to speak in favor of republicanism. Again, we're talking about Mussolini coming from the experience of, the democratic sort of Italian nationalist soaked in blood, coming back from the experience of socialism. Of course, he's going to come out of a febrile atmosphere of republicanism, especially if we're going to see that, in the same way that the German right were able to denigrate the November criminals, the king ultimately is the man in charge of Italy's foreign policy, is ultimately, in a way, responsible, even though they would try to escape that claim as having been responsible for the mutilated victory by accepting the peace treaty. So again, that builds into this whole idea of republicanism among early fascism. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think so, and especially in Mussolini's case, having himself been, as we know, a socialist, and um, having come from that sort of, how can I put this, from socialism to what would become nascent fascism via sort of a Republican sort of mindset and mentality. It's kind of an interesting pathway he takes to get from sort of A to Z, and it's through that mentality of somehow embracing Republican principles, whilst experiencing a conversion to nationalism as well. I think it's fair personally, but I just find it to this day I still find it an intriguing process.
In 1920, Mussolini discussed a plan with D'Annunzio for an anti-monarchist revolution, but remained open to offers from the opposite side. Moreover, other prominent fascists, notably General de Bono and Cesare De Vecchi, were dedicated supporters of the monarchy, and sometimes hinted at turning against the leader if he held to his republican opinions. In the case of de Bono, this was eventually borne out. Um, I don't remember if De Vecchi was a member of the Grand Council of Fascism by then, but anyway. Mussolini, as a party leader, was summoned to give his views at the Quirinal, where Giolitti resigned in June of 1921. Giolitti, as I mentioned, the liberal sort of paramount prime minister during the pre-war era. He was summoned again for half an hour when Bonomi gave way to Luigi Facta in February of 1922. These were the previous prime ministers before Mussolini in 1922. And it was noted with surprise that this ostentatiously plebeian outsider procured a top hat for the occasion in deference to official protocol. You can see that on the thumbnail I chose, which is Mussolini with his rather preposterous top hat riding in the royal the royal litter with the king. Yet another, and he was mocked relentlessly for this as well.
Of which there is footage, by the way, if you search for it on YouTube.
Yet another surprise was that this ex-socialist went straight from the palace to a long meeting with the strongly monarchist Nationalist Party and some of the right-wing liberals, and the object of this meeting was to discuss fomenting a common policy. Possibly, some such coalition was what the king had mentioned to him, because the lack of agreement between small parties was the reason why 3 successive prime ministers had failed to form a stable majority in parliament. A few days later, the fascist leader was summoned to the palace for another longer meeting about which, once again, we can only speculate. So confident, and again, this is in continuation with what we understand essentially with all monarchies and British monarchies, that the private conversations between ministers are obviously not going to be held for public record. So confident was Mussolini that early in 1922, he spoke of himself and the king as being the only 2 serious forces in Italian politics. You can see the inception of a personal sort of idea of diarchy, the rule between the king and Mussolini. Parliament was to his mind almost irrelevant, and he rarely bothered to attend its sessions, nor did he conceal that he was resolutely anti-democratic. Winning power was his aim, Mussolini's aim, and already before seeing him, the king would have known of his published desire for a military dictatorship. Mussolini let it be known that he would support the monarchy if no action was taken against the fascist movement, but hinting that otherwise anything could happen. So ultimately, Mussolini is an opportunist. By principle, fascism sort of lends itself towards the ideas of republicanism. But who am I to say essentially if Vittorio Emanuele would inexplicably offer me an olive branch, which is ultimately what would happen.
Indeed.
Early in August, Mussolini began to talk of a possible march on Rome, while making it clear that he would still take power by peaceable means if given the chance. His major fear was of the army, because even those generals who sympathized with fascism were almost certainly more royalist than fascist, whereas other generals were anti-fascist, and almost all of them, would obey any royal order to support the government. This again consistent with the idea that the king is the supreme commander of the armed forces. Likewise, the armed squads of the Nationalist Party would back the king against any fascist revolution. To neutralize any opposition from the Conservatives, Mussolini therefore played on the theme of patriotic sentiment, advocating an imperialist policy for the annexation of Dalmatia. We talked about that ad nauseum. He even talked about fighting to destroy the British Empire and convert the Mediterranean into an Italian lake. Realizing that his fascist supporters were turning away from republicanism, he decided to move in the same direction after calculating that this would make him more acceptable to the conservative establishment, and no decision in his life was more timely. The king is said to have been in touch with some fascist sympathizers early in 1922, and this is not improbable. Facta, the prime minister at the time, remembered discussing with him early in autumn whether fascism could ever be trusted as a participant in government. In mid-September, Mussolini declared in a public speech that the monarchy might have a positive role to play as an element of continuity with Italy's past. He went on to argue that the crown had no interest in opposing fascism. On the contrary, the survival of the monarchy might depend on accepting the fascist belief that the parliamentary regime had failed and should still be replaced. And again, as we've basically seen with the king, and again, I can't help the consistent attitude I have towards him is any way to basically find a strong means by which to delegate power, which basically entrenches the interests of the House of Savoy. You could almost say that Mussolini is to Vittorio Emanuele III what Bismarck was to Wilhelm I, effectively. You want to find that strongman minister who can enable you to reign and hold on to your throne. Otherwise, the only seemingly sort of obvious result is abdication, given a crisis like the destabilization of Italian politics in 1922. Do you think that's a fair comparison?
I do. I do think so. And especially at a time where there's a sort of quite dramatic political flux within, a nation like Italy, because it's interesting to consider too that there's enormous political flux in a nation such as Germany, which suffered defeat and had, essentially the Weimar Republic imposed upon an unwilling populace, whereas Italy was on the side of the victors, yet it still itself still suffered this period of absolute paralysis and what ended up being a political a political disintegration, whilst being on the as a victor of the World War, which is sort of an intriguing comparison between the two.
Well, again, the reason I would say this is that, France had universal suffrage at this point, and it was already a
Indeed, that's
republic.
true. Yeah.
Britain established universal suffrage in 1918 and women's suffrage to some extent before enlarging it to basically be equivalent to men in 1928. So there was this expectation, even among the winning powers of World War One, that as we see the rise of Lenin and the rise of Bolshevism, there is this expectation that there needs to be some political and indeed financial compensation, whether it be in terms of political emancipation or social reforms, for the demobilized soldiers now coming back from the front. The case in Italy essentially is like, as we mentioned, Italy is closer to Germany in many ways politically than it is closer to Britain. And yet the monarchy, as many people are desperate to exhort Vittorio Emanuele III to do something, is not prepared to act. And in that situation, there simply isn't a political program, or there isn't a system which can basically satisfy the desires of the demobilized soldiers who are now coming back demobilized from the war. So I think it's actually fairly consistent that if you look at it comparatively, the British government was able to weather a similar situation in terms of social transformation, that the Italian
Hmm.
system was far more rigid, owing to the fact that, again, this was something attested to Umberto as well. One would hope that one has a king that reigns instead of governs, but instead that ultimately produces a political vacuum. The fact that the
Indeed.
king is unwilling to engage in factionalism, and so the king is basically awaiting events in order to find a situation where he can be presented with consensus effectively, where he doesn't have to feel imperiled for choosing one side or the other. But nevertheless, if we look at, say, for example, his foreign policy decisions again, they can be very, very divisive, because it seems that
Yeah.
the consistent element among the House of Savoy is, like I said, this bellicose duplicity, the fact that there is always this aspiration, given the opportunity, that Italy must emerge on the right side of a conflict with territorial acquisitions in order to fulfill the idea of a redeemed Italy.
In a sense, you could say internationally, um, almost excessively sort of active and almost uh, what's the word, like, not proactive is not the right word, but they would be energetically involved in international affairs whilst domestically being indescribably passive.
I would basically say that, I mean, there is a comparison to be made with, I don't know, maybe the quote unquote liberal empire period of the 1860s in France, because I would basically say, I've already alluded to the idea that the House of Savoy was Napoleonic, but it was Napoleonic in the sense that it always had to abide by this idea that Italy needs to expand to fulfill basically this imperialist aspiration of the redeemed Italy and great power status. And so the monarchy must always be seen to be pursuing a foreign policy which is conducive towards those aims. So if there is some great
I'd agree with that.
conflagration, if there is some great conflagration and the monarchy isn't taking up the mantle in order to seize those opportunities to realize those Italo-Napoleonic aspirations, that will seem to be an indictment against the whole revolutionary principle of the dynasty.
Hmm.
It's not, say, for example, an old monarchy in the sense that these are the determinate borders of which are
We're
hereby,
not talking Franz Josef here, for instance.
we're not talking historical means and inheritances. We're not talking
Mm.
about, the network of my peoples in the case of Austria-Hungary. We're talking
Hmm.
about there is an Italian nation, and you simply need to obtain it. There's always this aspiration towards the acquisition of all of the Italian peoples. In Germany, it became explicit policy in the 1930s and 1940s, but with Italy, is a
Mm.
policy that has basically engulfed the entire nature of the revolutionary monarchy. That has to be emphasized. Even though we
Of
talk about
course.
the maintenance of the social order, at its heart, the Italian monarchy is bellicose, it is revolutionary, and needs to find ways of being able to expand. And the king is decisive in terms of acting in ways that he believes achieves those purposes.
Indeed, and just something I'd like to buttress ever so slightly, just twofold. One, is that because you use the words of Italo-Napoleonic, and on one hand you have Napoleon, and I mean we've covered the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon extensively elsewhere, but Napoleon having found himself very much in the midst of the revolutionary forces within France, and then sort of by the time he becomes emperor, embodies sort of almost this Caesar-like archetype, and sort of what does he say? Like, I'm trying to think his exact words, saying along the lines of, I have become the revolution, or that I am the revolution. He embodies the revolutionary force and makes it imperial, right? And that somehow there's a much devolved spirit of that exists within the House of Savoy. The second thing, and I wanted to say this sort of earlier in the stream, is that the having been the geographical, to some point, sort of ethnic genesis of the Roman Empire, and before that the Roman Republic of antiquity, is that every sort of political entity, every polity that has existed in Italy since the fall of the West Roman Empire has lived in the shadows of that empire and lived in the shadows of that legacy. Doesn't matter whether it was the Lombards, or to some degree the Papal States, or the independent city states of Siena, Tuscany, Venice, Mantua. Take your pick, it doesn't matter. And then there's a prospect of sort of like a rebirth, and that would be sort of all too tantalizing for any Italian polity that would be within arm's reach of that dream being realized. So I think you sort of have it from two angles, if you get what I mean.
No, I think that's quite clear. So back to the creation of the fascist government under the king's auspices. The king kept his thoughts very much to himself, though he cannot have been uninfluenced by the opinions of these recognized leaders of liberal Italy. Prime Minister Factor's coalition was hopelessly divided, and Factor himself became increasingly indecisive. Despite what the socialists claimed, fascism was surely not much to the king's liking, but neither did he greatly like the machine politics of Giolitti, by that, gerrymandering and being able to control small constituencies, nor the latter's proclaimed policy of reducing the royal prerogative. Again, the whole idea of the monarchy holding on to its basically dynastic reserve powers, this obsession with holding on to power whilst also being adamant about never using it. Vittorio Emanuele disapproved of political violence and was much happier when a vote of parliament gave a clear indication on policy. But 10 times already in his reign, an extra parliamentary crisis had compelled him to enter the arena when more important decisions had to be taken. And now, once more, he feared being forced into an arbitral position that he would ultimately prefer to have avoided. The fascists numbered barely 6% of the deputies in Parliament. At court, however, there existed a group of proto-fascists, which included not only the Duke of Aosta, who the king cordially hated, mentioned as to why, but also the Queen Mother, who was enchanted by Mussolini and had no scruples about encouraging them. The chief royal aide-de-camp, General Tiadini. It's quite interesting, actually, how just in general, it's not really that relevant, but how Queen Margareta, the Queen Mother, is actually regarded by Smith as by far the most intelligent of all the members of the royal house, and that's probably the
Indeed.
intelligence one attributes to Vittoria Emanuele actually comes from her, who is also apparently very, very, very pro-monarchist and ultimately a hardline reactionary. Was thought to
Indeed.
sympathise with fascism, and similarly, Count Mattioli Pasqualini, who administered the royal household. This helps to explain why, to the puzzlement of some foreigners, the monarch remained so passive. But his tragedy, and no doubt his fault, was to prefer the company of soldiers and courtiers to politicians, especially the kind of soldiers whom General Cavalier called lapdogs rather than watchdogs. Giolitti and other politicians outside the cabinet were never allowed to give him the views except at moments of crisis, and sometimes not even them. So it's not like a situation where the monarch regularly consults or has standardized meetings with prime ministers invariably, and especially during the fascist period. The king would effectively be isolated from all affairs. And again, it's this whole, there are various contrivances that you see in various other monarchies in Europe, but the king himself very much preferred to be surrounded by soldiers and courtiers rather than politicians. And again, it's not exactly a unique feature of the House of Savoy, especially if we're going to say, for example, look at a contemporary like Queen Wilhelmina in the Netherlands, ruling over a far more quote unquote democratic regime. How such figures ultimately despise politicians. No comment was therefore forthcoming from the king's holiday home when Mussolini, on the 24th of October, after reviewing thousands of armed black shirts on the streets of Naples, announced he was about to march on Rome to take by the throat our miserable ruling class. The fascists were challenging the authority of the state by mobilizing an irregular army with the avowed intention of replacing what Mussolini called the ruling class. Ministers had at last decided to act against this revolution as their predecessors had acted against D'Annunzio, but by his uncharacteristic intervention, the king stopped them, thus attracting to himself much of the responsibility for the collapse of liberal Italy. Mussolini watched the unfolding of this drama from his editorial chair in Milan, near a possible escape route into Switzerland, as the critics pointed out. At first hint of martial law being applied, the fascist movement in Milan seemed to collapse in minutes, but a few hours later, contrary news arrived and was recognized as signifying capitulation by the state. An order to arrest Mussolini was even disobeyed by the prefect, who no doubt read the signs of the times and preferred to ingratiate himself with the victorious party. This act of disobedience was another crucial factor in the debacle. The king, at this point, might have taken soundings from parliamentary leaders, as was normal before appointing a new prime minister, but he chose not to, because he had already made up his mind. The only one he consulted was the conservative Salandra, who had been prime minister during World War One, who, instead of advising him to suppress the revolt, advised the opposite, and confirmed that the refusal to proclaim martial law was correct. Salandra suggested the immediate formation of a new government before Giolitti had time to arrive in Rome. Comforted by this, by advice, the king invited Salandra to take office, who almost certainly, with the king's approval, or, at his request, immediately turned for help not to the other liberal leaders, but to the fascists, De Vecchi and Dino Grandi, informing them with astonishing naivete that he would accept the royal mandate only if Mussolini agreed to join the cabinet. Mussolini realized from this final capitulation that the fascists could name their own terms and reply to an invitation from the palace by refusing any subordinate position, requiring nothing less than the premiership for himself, for Mussolini. No one had ever treated the sovereign in such unceremonious and threatening manner. Mussolini's demand was further supported by Albertini and a group of leading Milanese industrialists, who sent an urgent telegram to Rome advising acceptance, no doubt fearing that the only alternative was a return to power of Giolitti with a programme of unacceptable social reforms. Early on the 29th, Mussolini was invited to form a government, and Salandra himself was overjoyed at the happy ending to this crisis. Now, before I give my interpretation of this, overall, what do you think ultimately motivated the king to take the step of inviting to form a government a man who basically had threatened to depose the dynasty and throw out the entire miserable ruling class, to use Mussolini's direct words?
Well, I think, interesting. I think we have to sort of consider that at this point in time, Mussolini is a man in political, dare I say, ideological transition. And he no doubt is expressing at this point strong nationalistic sentiments, but he obviously has a very recent history of socialistic tendencies. Those remarks about the ruling class and disposing of them, for instance, obviously touches close to a nerve, particularly for those of the upper sort of and very much aristocratic classes. Also, we must keep in mind as well that this is in the midst of the Bolsheviks are on the brink of winning the civil war, have just won the civil war in Russia, and so there's obviously a sense of concern amongst aristocracies in Europe as to what actually occurs when Bolsheviks do succeed in a sort of civil domestic struggle. And so, and I've obviously sort of heard a lot over the years regarding what actually the feelings were of people this time, and that is that for all the bluster of, and particularly of that more class-driven psychology of, let's call it the left side of fascism, that it was actually the fascists that are the only ones who had the presence and power in Italian society to actually keep the left at bay. A lot of people don't realize that for a number of decades, particularly even after World War II, that the Italian Socialist Party was the strongest political socialist force outside the Iron Curtain in Europe for decades. And so there was a very strong socialist undercurrent in Italy, even at this point in time. And
And
my
that, again,
summation
is
is always
due to the very legacy of the fact that the whole conception of Italy was itself revolutionary and thereby inclined to
correct.
socialism, like we see with someone like Mazzini.
Indeed, indeed, very correct. And so I've always been of the appraisal, or at least for the longest time, I've been of the appraisal that um, the king and his advisors and those elements of Italian society um, figured that Mussolini would be the easiest person to work with in this sense, and that not just that, but the forces behind Mussolini were probably the only forces sufficiently powerful to contain the socialists in Italy. That's been my view.
I think it's interesting because the bit I'm going to read is very much sort of a post hoc sort of justification for it. But
Hmm.
what I find quite interesting is that also a lot of it can go both ways. You can basically say, oh well, isn't it great that after the king did this, there was a huge amount of you can say support from non-fascists for this decision, but the king couldn't have known that at the time. But you have to also conceive by that point of view, you can't go around calling the March on Rome, a comedy of errors and things like that, which a lot of people, as Smith himself alluded to, the idea that Mussolini wasn't one of the men leading the march. He was in Milan ready to flee over to Switzerland if there was anything wrong. And there was a moment where, the implementation of martial law, which was immediately countermanded, could have immediately dissuaded the movement. Mussolini could not have known, I'm sorry, the king could not necessarily have known that. And again, that's the idea of there was a strong anti-socialist military bulwark in the form of the black militias against the Reds, and the idea of the army having to fight for the king against these militias who could be better used in terms of being able to, as I've already alluded to, reduce the threat of the Reds and ultimately the socialists. I think it's also important to consider that the intervention of the Milanese industrialists, I believe, is also decisive, because despite the quote unquote revolutionary character of Italian fascism, I do think, as I've been at pains to say, in terms of referring to continuity in the House of Savoy, what does the makeup of the sort of people who support the House of Savoy ultimately look like? Well, we're talking about an anti clerical aristocracy and a large sort of bourgeois constituency. All of those factors also seem to be rather conducive to the fascist supporters, don't they? So it seems to be there is actually a unique synergy between the monarchist supporters and the fascist supporters. And
Indeed.
if Mussolini, as he was claimed so often, is this great man of action, then simply fascism could be sublimated to the cause of the monarchists, even though Mussolini would like to see it as being the exact opposite, which is
Hmm.
why I read out the section of so many members of the immediate household effectively being at least amenable to fascism, if not, outright fascists in their own right. So thereby this logic whereby it is seen essentially as the lesser threat. The liberal parliamentarians basically are duplicitous. And if we, say, for example, move in the direction towards Britain, or even worse, France, we could be seen to be losing all of our prerogatives. And again, I have to look back at the king's anti-clericalism and say that ultimately, the socialist national roots of the Mussolini sort of fascist movement are fundamentally anti-clerical, anti-religious, anti-Catholic. They become less so later on, as we see with other elements of, you can say, the institutionalization of fascism within Italian society. But that again is something which very much appeals to the king's own constituency, because one of
Indeed.
the things he fears is not so much the rise of the Red International, but going back to Bismarck again. I hate to bring in so many comparisons with Germany, but they really are pertinent. It's not just the fear of the Red International, but it's the fear of the Black International. The international, the cassock and and the priest and
Hmm.
Catholic politics being able, and Rerum Novarum being able to undermine the whole basis of the secular Italian state. So in this case, it would seem that Italian fascism is actually, if we look at this, shorn of its more excessive revolutionary elements, would actually be seen to be conducive. And as we will ultimately talk about with foreign policy, very conducive indeed. But indeed, it seemed that on the face of it, I mean, like I said, the remarkable thing about this is not necessarily why the king would decide to do this, but the fact that the king decided to make the decision in spite of all of the advice of his parliamentarians. And basically, you can say, like we see with foreign policy, this is one of the very few acts that we see in his entire reign, which seems to be an act taken on his own volition, of which we basically have barely any accounting, because when the king is often pressed on important matters by courtiers or even foreign ambassadors, he will often do the Francisco Franco way of dealing with diplomacy, which is, Francisco Franco famously talked to Hitler about his chickens. In the case of Vittorio Emanuele III, he would talk to politicians and ambassadors about local hunting. Oh look, my wife shot a quail today, will be the response. Say, for example, if he declares war on a country.
Yes, ultimate deflection strategy.
Rome during the days of the 28th to the 30th of October wasn't on fete, with crowds cheering the king. Now they knew in which direction he was moving. There was some violence. Shops and houses were looted, embassies invaded, and one of Mussolini's first actions was to order the scientific destruction of the offices of the main socialist and liberal newspapers. In later years, he wondered if she had not immediately deposed the king and executed the opposition leaders, but there was no need, because his victory was complete, and there was a familiar stampede by members of parliament to ingratiate themselves with the new prime minister. He himself reached Rome on the 30th of October by sleeping in the car and arrived at the palace wearing the black shirt of fascism. When he returned soon afterwards to present a list of ministers, he had changed into an ill-fitting morning dress and accessories borrowed from various colleagues. Only the socialists did not join his cabinet. Liberals, radicals, and the popolari accepted. Even if they had some private reservations, not one of those he invited refused. None even asked for a serious preliminary discussion of policy. Never had a government been formed so quickly and easily. The king welcomed this as fully justifying his decision. He was no doubt relieved at Mussolini's timely demonstration of a desire for consensus and moderation, as he must have been delighted when the political leaders Salandra, Giolitti, Orlando, and Rinaldi all made public declarations of support. The editor of the Corriere della Sera, while objecting that the cabinet included representatives of the moderate left, praised fascism for saving Italy from the socialist menace. The socialists, of Mussolini admitted, might possibly have frustrated his triumph if they had proclaimed a general strike, but Pietro Nenni declared that the collapse of the liberal state was regarded by the extreme left with virtual indifference. Fascism, they thought, would merely be ways of obstacles in the way of their own more serious revolution. Again, I would say almost references to the liberal state are a bit unwarranted, because I don't believe it ever really existed. You can say it was a liberal experiment more than it was a liberal state. You can't look at the Italian monarchy in phases of, oh, well, there's the monarchical period, the liberal period, and the fascist period, because all periods were effectively unsettled. They weren't successfully mauled, and they weren't ingrained in terms of
And not
hardline.
particularly well defined either.
They weren't well defined, they were vulnerable, and they didn't establish long-term political traditions. Which is important to note, which is why effectively something like this could have happened. I also wonder, a lot of this is basically laying claim that it's Mussolini's appointment is the one which basically galvanizes and establishes this consensus view against socialism. I would actually argue the opposite. I think it's more that these quote unquote center-rightists and monarchists have been so desperate that the king has to intervene on any issue. There's the fact that the king appointed Mussolini, rather than the fact that Mussolini has been appointed, is the thing that's causing the consensus effectively. That, oh, well, we will rally behind the monarch's decision. Now he has finally decided to weigh and act decisively within this particular moment. We've only been waiting 22 years, for him to actually use his prerogatives, and he's finally decided to use them. So we will use this as a moment basically to galvanize our support around the monarchy. But of course, this went both ways. In the short term, this enabled, you can say, a brief euphoria, the fact that this revolution from above had institutional support, and it was a revolution from above, even though Mussolini would basically present it as a revolution from below, that he was seizing power rather than being offered it. But I think another point to mention here is the fact that the king also decided to make this decisive adventure. By declaring Mussolini as prime minister. He had broken his cardinal rule, which was to side with a faction, even though it took 20 years for that faction to effectively fall out of power. Ultimately, he was responsible for implementing that faction's rule in the first place. And so his ultimate fear would ultimately come to pass. So I think that's fair to say. But regarding his actual view of Mussolini in person, Vittorio Emanuele cannot have much liked hearing himself applauded as the fascist king. At first, he gave the impression that Mussolini's ascension to power was not particularly irregular, and perhaps hardly realized that he was riding on the back of a revolution. Another point to mention, this isn't a situation like we see in Britain where a parliamentarian is able to come to the king with a clear majority and be offered to form the right to form a government. Basically, the king is forced to deal with months, if not years, of negotiations between various cabals of parliamentarians. So the king is
Yeah,
the
and
king is
basically never ending up with governments with mandates, essentially.
Yes, exactly. So the idea in not being particularly irregular in the sense that the king appoints the prime minister, well, yes, that is strictly true. As a self-confessed fatalist, he admired only an indirect responsibility because he had learnt from history that political events were much more automatic than a result of individual action and of influence. Again, perhaps a way of ultimately avoiding so much responsibility is by donning the mantle of, not nihilism but fatalism, effectively being nothing than a reciprocal for events in that sense. But of course, he couldn't have been that much of a fatalist, because then he wouldn't have been so concerned with holding on to the prerogatives effectively of the monarchy. You can see, fatalism, say, for example, overcome someone like Nicholas II, who basically began to look at himself as Job the long-suffering, and ultimately his reign will end in a horrific martyrdom, which ultimately you can say in a manner of words ultimately comes to pass. But, no such sort of awe of sort of spiritual sort of uh, spiritual sort of consumption sort of overwhelms the figure of Vittorio Emanuele. Like I say, I see him as a far more sort of a depressive, melancholic person, which would perhaps inform his fatalism, rather than looking at, say, for example, fatalism in a strictly spiritual sense of willing these events to God, even though I'm looking perhaps far too much into it. Mussolini's appointment, he said, was not strictly unconstitutional, and probably the new cabinet would have lasted no longer than previous administrations. In the meantime, he welcomed the restoration of order and authority under the new regime. He appreciated Mussolini's patriotism and outward deference to the monarchy, just as he greatly preferred a minister who knew his own mind and made political decisions seem easy. Again, another factor, the idea that the king wants to be basically released from the responsibility of having to become involved in the minutiae of decision making. Above all, he welcomed the relief from political crises, which everyone expected the crown to resolve. A number of people soon learnt of his admiration for Mussolini's industry, his judgment, quick understanding of political problems, and almost certainly his appreciation was genuine. He did not readily award praise, but bestowed more on the Duce than on any of his other 17 prime ministers, and his sense of relief was immediate. Never before had the royal family accepted invitations from a political party, but their presence at the Palazzo Venezia in October 1923 must have seemed a special kind of royal investiture, and ordinary citizens must have been encouraged to think that fascism was particularly acceptable now at court. Far from reciprocating this admiration, Mussolini sometimes referred to his sovereign as a useless and boring person, too diminutive for an Italy destined to be great. In Mussolini's entourage, there was much anger at popular demonstrations of monarchist loyalty, which were taken as indirect criticisms of fascism. The crown was nevertheless useful in attracting the loyalty of conservatives and the army to the new regime, for which the prime minister was genuinely grateful, and he therefore continued to observe the formalities, regularly going to the palace twice a week in morning suit and spats like any normal bourgeois minister. Wherever there was much serious discussion of the policy of these occasions cannot be known, and Mussolini let it be thought that he slightly resented them as a chore because his republican instincts were not entirely dead. One day he warned a more serious fascist revolution would take place, and at this time without contraceptives. In the meantime, he would diminish the royal prerogatives piecemeal, plucking the chicken feather by feather to lessen its squawking. Because I've been talking for quite a long time, can you think of any examples of plucking the chicken and ultimately leading to that analogy?
Um, I have to say, don't really have a lot to add in that sense. But what I will say is, I think the summarization of the king's sort of mentality or his sort of character as having a melancholic streak is actually quite true. And also the fact that, considered a comparison to sort of other, monarchs of the time, obviously slightly prior to his time, even say like, Nicholas or Wilhelm or George, the great monarchs of Northern and Eastern Europe in the case of Russia. He definitely cuts a very different figure. Never mind his actual short stature, which people have been joking about in the chat. But that he does have this more of a not necessarily an aloofness, but he does have this streak towards him or about him that is definitely a bit melancholic and almost sort of subdued in a sense, and that he sort of acts when he's absolutely forced to act. Um, the thing about the plucking the chickens, that analogy is interesting. It's actually something I haven't really thought of before nor encountered, so I kind of haven't reached a conclusion on that yet. But I think it's an interesting way of having described it. And as can be, if one was to actually have a look at how events would transpire going forward in many, what seems apparent to me is that for the longest while it probably seemed as if it was Mussolini who probably felt as if he would benefit more from keeping the monarchy in place, and that in keeping the royal affectations of the Italian government apparatus intact would benefit him. Although that in itself would sort of partly be the reason why he would ultimately suffer his political downfall in 1943, because he sort of kept that part of the Italian state system attached to the fascist movement and the fascist government, and meanwhile he kept the one person in political proximity who could actually dismiss him, which was of course the king.
Well, there are two big examples which point out to me, and again we're talking about this formalization essentially of a diarchy. On the one hand, Mussolini is constitutionally deferential towards the king because he's really the only person who can dismiss him and ultimately will dismiss him. But Mussolini takes upon himself to award himself the marshal rank of first marshal of the empire shortly following from the conquest of Abyssinia. And this is a clear example of the idea of the prime minister holding a role which should be monopolized by the king. The idea that the prime minister has a institutionalized martial role and an equivalent rank with the king, of course, is seen as a great affront to the king. The idea that traditionally the king would be able to introduce legislation with only one minister having to countersign it. But now we have a situation where all legislation comes from Mussolini, and Mussolini essentially has the right to initiate legislation. You can almost say that, ironically, Italy is now embarking upon its own experiment as if it had a prime minister in the the modern sense, rather than, you can say, in the sort of classical monarchist sense, where the monarch has all these residual powers. But I would say the greatest direct affront to the king's power, at least as he considered in the time, was a few years later in 1925, when Mussolini changes the constitution to create the Grand Council of Fascism as a state body. The Grand Council of Fascism, up until that point, had been a party body as an extension of the fascist party. But the idea of Mussolini effectively was to give it the role, almost bypassing cabinet and almost giving it the right to deal with issues which the monarch basically believed were indispensable in terms of the whole makeup of the Statuto, the Constitution of Italy, which was the right to declare war, i.e. the fact that the council could be consulted before declaring war, and the idea, rather inflammatory idea that was never actually put into practice, that the council had the right to declare a successor to the monarchy, i.e. that any sort of future sort of inheritance would not necessarily go to Vittorio Emanuele, that when he died, someone else could be appointed, perhaps even Mussolini himself could inherit the title of monarchy, and then perhaps duly abolish it in order to amalgamate all the powers to the office of the Duce, simply the leader. That was perhaps, you can say, the most obvious attempt that the king believed that his powers were being usurped. The irony, of course, is, as we both know, and as the chat will soon know, the Grand Council of Fascism, at once seen as this great threat to the whole nature of the monarchy in Italy, was actually the device by which Mussolini would be deposed and not Vittorio Emanuele. There are other elements, of course, which you can say reflect this, which is the creation of the Acerbo law. The Acerbo law was implemented before the last, you can say, competitive elections in Italy before the war, which effectively allowed for a party which had a plurality of support and over 25% of the vote to automatically have a supermajority in the Italian parliament. basically meaning that whoever won the largest number of votes in an election, despite the actual number of votes, would have a guaranteed majority. In theory, of course, this meant that the fascist party could win an election without having to worry about proportional representation or gerrymandering, as we see before. But the king, when he came to power in 1900, off the back of the repressive measures of Pero and Umberto just before he was assassinated, had sworn an oath to uphold the institutions of the quote-unquote liberal constitution of Italy, and then meant deference to the Senate, and that meant deference to the House of Representatives. And what Mussolini was effectively doing was turning the parliament into a rubber stamp for his own administration. But I don't necessarily say that is inveigling upon the king's own prerogatives. You could say it basically dismantles the oath because Parliament has been made a nonsense, and ultimately Mussolini will dissolve Parliament and reconstitute it as the institution of the national corporations of Italy, I think in 1938, 1939. But at the time, you would see the Acerbo law was actually a way of giving the king what he always wanted, which was a definite majority with which to tell him what to do, basically, so he could avoid responsibility. But nevertheless, it is that element of, you can say, the king having to grapple with the fact that he's violating his oath to uphold the nature of this institution, this body. He had allowed reforms to it previously in 1912 with Giolitti, and in 1990 with Nitti's proportional representation. But it seems that the Acerbo law, again, the obvious intention was for Mussolini to make it a superfluous institution. And indeed, he would implement rules which basically ensured that you had to vote a certain way. If you didn't vote a certain way, you'll be disciplined as a result of it. And ultimately, all non-fascist parties in Italy were banned, along with their newspapers, which again would be seen to be outright affronts to the king's own constitutional oath. But he didn't decide to intercede. Like I said, it seems the motivation is always to concede to the will of the quote-unquote consensus, even though we see, as Mussolini is very obviously accruing more and more power, as was his obvious and stated objective right from the beginning, it should be noted. More and more of these liberal ministers, such as Orlando and Salandra, who have supported it, are basically losing faith with this institution. But then again, you have figures, very eminent figures like Benedetto Croce, who perhaps people in the chat have shared. I refer to him several times in this channel, a great sort of a philosopher of history itself. Initially supported fascism and then repudiated his association and blamed everything on the king. So, like I said, there was this clear element of consensus. What seriously upsets that, I think, it's clear to see, is the culpability of Mussolini and the fascist squads in the assassination of Matteotti. It wasn't so much that we would expect, in a regime basically born out on self-avowed principles of totalitarianism, to go around and purging and killing its opposition. But it's the fact that it was used in such a blatant and obvious way, which had direct and obvious implications for so many involved, which effectively had the implication of lambasting the whole very nature of Mussolini's government as being fundamentally criminal and thuggish. And it was that, perhaps more than any other incident, up until we see the declaration of war on France and Britain in 1940, that causes such outrage among the Italian elites that appeal directly to the king to depose Mussolini on the basis of his culpability in Matteotti's murder. Matteotti, just for reference, was a socialist MP who had denounced the whole nature of the fascist party victory in 1924 following the implementation of the Acerbo law.
Indeed. And the other thing is too is that even for the fascists themselves, who are quite unapologetically, how can I put this, sort of forceful in their methods, you got to think there's a whole sort of like this, not so much symbolism, but the phrase that the squadristi would use, me ne frego, saying like I don't care, like they would literally sort of have a foot on one of their political opponents while they're sort of engaging in their physical thuggish activities against their political opponents. That even in that culture, or that even in that sort of I'll use the word culture for lack of a better one, that even for them, the death of that event caused a lot of controversy, not even throughout Italy, but even within the fascist party, of people who thought it was actually like a politically tactical error
Well,
You
yes,
know.
just to emphasize this, the fear was essentially that the black shirts responsible for it.
Mm.
They feared during the time, especially from the monarchy, that they were all going to be rounded up and shot for it,
Essentially, yeah.
and so they actually invaded Mussolini's office and basically demanded to be rescued from the situation. Of course, Mussolini sided with the black shirts. So again, it was still this situation of consolidation where Mussolini's power was not seen as absolute, where the situation could have gone either way, and it created a huge amount of turmoil among fascism, especially between the monarchists, who believed that fascism, quote unquote, was supposed to be a force for order, and on the other
Hmm.
hand, that fascism was just clearly a force for thuggery and criminality was the association, and of course for the monarchy. This became deeply embarrassing because it was thereby implicated by association that the government was responsible for this.
And also, too, let's. I mean, I know there's been ample comparisons with Germany in the stream, for better or for worse. But if we look at, say, the purge of the SA that occurred in Germany, sometime after this, um, the black shirts probably, in retrospect, might have feared something similar would have possibly occurred to them, which it didn't actually do in Italy. But we saw, obviously, with the purging of the SA and the killing of Ernst Röhm and a number of their leaders, at the behest of, um, well, whether Hitler arranged it or not, it's not the matter. But in the aftermath of Night of the Long Knives, definitely there would have been some kind of feeling that perhaps those who'd masterminded the death of Matteotti would, suffer sort of a similar fate, I suppose, one which we would later see with the Night of the Long Knives in Germany.
The interesting thing is, the king does not intercede, even though it causes a huge amount of division between fascists within the fascist movement, and Mussolini continues to consolidate his position over the next few
And public
years.
controversy writ large in Italy, of course.
Yes, of course. There are elements in which the king is able to prove himself victorious over Mussolini. Mussolini wants to change the flag to replace the Savoyard badge, the Cross of Savoy, with the fasces on the flag. He's able to avoid doing that, so the crown still retains its status as the national emblem of Italy. But again, interestingly enough, what does Mussolini do? He is the one who's responsible for ending the Dissidio with the Catholic Church by embracing the Lateran Treaty with then Pope Pius XI. And it's interesting to consider that the king had played with this idea very early on in his reign. And you can see, again, this part of the general spirit of reconciliation. But general spirit of reconciliation. But he ultimately decides to go against this very firmly in the aftermath of World War One, when, like I've mentioned various times, he sees that the Catholic Church, in a political form, is basically a analogous threat to the threat of socialists. But nevertheless, Mussolini, unlike, say, for example, a figure like Orlando, who had tried, is the figure who ultimately is able to, I wouldn't say compel the king, but overrule the king in basically allowing for this division that had basically marked out and damaged the legitimacy and the whole sacrosanct nature, quote unquote, of the House of Savoy. And this basically ultimately results in a very grand and ostentatious visit by the king to the Vatican in 1939, in which the king makes a demonstration of kneeling to kiss the ring, but the Pope, in deference, comes back and allows the king to stand, so he doesn't have to make such a gesture. So other elements like that, which ironically Mussolini is able to solve the problem for the monarchy, which had basically governed the situation or determined the whole quote unquote status of the prisoner in the Vatican, which the popes described themselves as during the pontificates of Pius IX, Leo XIII, and Pius X, Benedict XV. So it's interesting to consider that Mussolini ultimately is the one who's able to resolve that situation. But we're going to finish this off, of course, by talking about foreign policy, Marcus, and coming back to the idea that Mussolini, as we mentioned, was interested in acquiring places in Dalmatia. He was interested in turning Italy into the great power on the Mediterranean, into establishing essentially an Italian lake in the Mediterranean by taking Gibraltar, by taking Malta, by consolidating the presence of Italy in East Africa. And this, of course, all had the rapturous approval of the king, who very much shared in that same foreign policy outlet. And there's another little sort of, I would say, interesting irony here I've been at pains to sort of mention, Marcus, how it seemed that the revolutionaries were always one step ahead of the monarchy in terms of being able to win concessions for Italy, like we see with Naples and Palermo, like we see with Rome, like we see with Fiume. But in the case of Abyssinia, Mussolini had tried to win Abyssinia to the fascists by first appointing De Bono to basically launch a quote unquote fascist operation
Hmm.
against the Ethiopians at Adwa, and he entered Axum and made this sort of grand uh, presentation of him being in the ancient, capital of Ethiopia as it existed some 2,000 years before. But then he didn't get any further, and it required the royal army to come in, associated by four of the Savoy dukes under Bergoglio, who eventually won that conflict. And I think this is one of the very few instances where we see the royal army is actually the effective force in expanding Italy vis-a-vis the revolutionary forces. If we're going to look at De Bono as some completely failed version of a Garibaldi in Ethiopia.
I think to some degree that's probably valid, and also too that we have to also take into account that even though De Bono was politically active in being a monarchical supporter of the fascists and fascism writ large, um, he was sort of a man out of his time too. Like there were other, even though he sort of easily wasn't blessed with the sort of cadre of commanders of say, Germany or the Soviet Union or Britain or America, say, um, but there were capable commanders in Italy. And for instance, uh, as an example, although one would obviously state that his methods were brutal, but you know, Rodolfo Graziani demonstrated pretty aptly how to fight an insurgency in Libya, for instance, whereas De Bono sort of very much fumbled that Abyssinian campaign. And like as you said, it was actually at the behest of Badoglio, who was one of the marshals of the Italian army, who had to sort of um, bring about the conflict to a better conclusion and set about it in a very different way and not rely on the strictly revolutionary forces, as you've mentioned, which I think does highlight not just the deficiencies of the revolutionary force in the strictest military sense of the word, but De Bono being the representation of that bridge between the military and revolutionary forces, himself not being a particularly adept general either.
But again, it's this emphasis of the thing that we've been mentioning, the collaboration between the revolutionary and the royal forces, and each one is trying to gain concessions to outdo the other. And the irony, of
Correct.
course, is that Mussolini, very much throughout the early sort of period of World War Two, and even before then, is actually pursuing a foreign policy in deference, almost in total deference to what Vittorio Emanuele II, the original, the gallant gentleman king of Italy, would have loved.
Mm.
So, for example, what is one of his aims in supporting Franco in Spain? Well, he hopes. By the Spanish Civil War, the nationalists on the one hand, supported by the Italians against the Republicans, supported by the Soviet Union. Franco, Mussolini hopes that Franco will install a Italian prince as king of Spain, and this
Mhm.
had a legacy to it in the fact that during a brief period in the 1870s, Amadeo, the ancestor of the now Viceroy of East Africa, had been placed on the throne of Spain, only to be deposed. And the idea essentially was, well, you can have a fascist Italian king, even though that would have completely alienated the nationalists from the Carlists and from those who still supported the claimant of the Bourbons and Alfonso XIII. But nevertheless, it's interesting that as Mussolini is the one who's trying to pursue the Savoyard dynastic foreign policy of putting, so
Indeed.
because Vittorio Emanuele II, for reference, during the 19th century, he had tried to put him, Amadeo, on the throne of Greece, then on the throne of Romania, and ultimately on the throne of Spain. Now it's Mussolini who's the one doing this, and who is the one who is actually suspicious of this move? It's King Vittorio Emanuele III, because he believes essentially that he doesn't want to empower his cousin by any means at all. And
Hmm.
my cynical viewing of it is, of course, having him as viceroy of Italian East Africa, i.e., Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia, was perfect because he was far away from Rome.
Hmm.
He was no threat to Vittorio Emanuele, ruling over and trying to control the Ethiopian insurgency. So Vittorio Emanuele III was so possessed of his prerogatives that invariably his ire was shown towards his own family, if not his own son, who had a very fraught relationship. Ultimately, the belated and fateful Umberto II, who would be the last titular king of Italy. And this continues,
For a very short period of time as well, mind you.
for, well, you can say 2-3 years if you concede the
Mm,
lieutenancy, but ultimately just the 1 year. But
exactly.
if we look at another example, Ermione, another cousin of Vittorio Emanuele II, is given the throne of Croatia once the Italians and the Germans and the Hungarians invade Yugoslavia in 1941, and he establishes himself as Tomislav II of Croatia. Vittorio Emanuele II refers to him as mentally defective. It has nothing but ultimate scorn and derision for his relatives that he's putting on the throne, and it seems to be this major concession to them. He's decided to put members of the House of Savoy on all of these different thrones. So it seems to me very interesting that Mussolini, as he ages, is sort of erstwhile actually sort of looking at this diarchy, this alliance between the House of Savoy, and he's trying to ameliorate his views on foreign policy by allowing for these dynastic concessions. But nevertheless, I would say this results in one of the worst disasters for Italy, we've mentioned elsewhere on the channel, which is the decision to declare war alongside Germany in World War II. And I've mentioned elsewhere on the channel that I believe was fundamentally Mussolini's decision, but ultimately I actually believe the king, as we see with World War One, has a lot of the culpability. And the reason I say that is that in spite of all of Mussolini's overtures, the king still retained a huge amount of royal prerogatives when it came to running Italy's foreign policy. And he had a huge army of his own private informants who went around and basically gauged the opinions of both parties, whether it be the Germans or his own preference towards the French and the British. And
Mm,
ultimately, um, a large number of fascists, as we saw with the assassination of Matteotti, appealed directly over the head of Mussolini to the king to not get Italy involved and to retain its status of non-belligerent nation during World
indeed.
War II. It was the same when Mussolini introduced the anti-Jewish racial laws in 1938, but we have figures particularly like Dino Grandi. Dino Grandi was one of the most prominent fascist officials. He wasn't one of the original Condrenvia, i.e. the four leaders of the March on Rome. Italo Balbo would die very shortly into the war due to a plane crash in Libya, leaving Grandi even more powerful. But Dino Grandi had effectively always pursued a pro-British policy. He had been ambassador and foreign minister, and he was the head of the chamber of the Council of Fascist Corporations, which was the Italian successor to the Parliament. And what that meant is that he, in addition to being justice minister, was actually there in the palace, acting in that role of minister, countersigning all of the king's legislation, as was the traditional role set up by the Statuto under Charles Albert in 1948. That also meant that he had regular contact with the king. And it was Dino Grandi, among figures like De Bono and the Grand Council of Fascism, that appealed to the king to say, no, don't get involved in the war. So why did the king basically concede to Mussolini and his whole aspiration to have a couple of thousand dead so I can sit at the table as a man who fought, which was Mussolini's rationale effectively for entering the war, for a very similar
Indeed.
reason, for a very similar reason that Italy entered World War One, which is that Italy can join the war at the end in the hope essentially of being able to accrue concessions from the defeated party. In this case, this would mean the French losing Tunisia, um, Savoy, and Corsica, Djibouti as well, and occupying a large part of France. Perhaps the idea was to expand Italian occupation up to the River Rhone, which is one of the largest rivers in France. And that would be enough. But of course, as we know, Mussolini gets involved in the war. The British do not back down. He gets involved in a disastrous campaign in North Africa. And then, if anything,
And sends 500,000 men to Russia as well, which also ends badly.
but before then, we have the Greek debacle, as you're well aware
Indeed.
of. And
Yes,
another
yes, yes.
thing to actually alienate Mussolini from many of the fascists who then appeal to the king is that during the more, you can say, revolutionary days of the fascist party, there was a rule set about that if there were ever a conflict, fascist ministers would have to serve on the front lines. And when the Greek campaign happens, what does Mussolini do? He sends figures like Dino Grande, who he knows who are completely enamored with him, to fight on the
Hmm.
front in Albania, and hopefully perhaps all die. And in the interim, Mussolini would declare himself minister pro tem over basically all of the government departments of Italy,
Hmm. Yeah.
whilst also becoming depressed and having a mental breakdown. So things go very, very badly. We have the king becoming more isolated, Mussolini devolving into delusions of grandeur, him, as you mentioned, getting involved in a war in the Soviet Union, which almost unanimously held to the view that was not Italy's fight. There was the loss of East Africa, which again was a major loss to the dynasty. As I mentioned, the whole notion of Bergoglio and Prince Amadeo, and the whole notion of it being basically a royal colony as much as a fascist colony. And many questions are basically asked is that why did the king not intervene sooner, given the fact that the writing was on the wall almost immediately? Italy never had a moment essentially where they were winning the war. Right from the beginning, effectively, the Italians were on the back foot. Even though Italy was able, for example, to gain concessions with the annexation of Yugoslavia, so we're talking about Ljubljana, Dalmatia, the acquisition of Albania, which itself was basically a consolation prize awarded by the Germans.
The title, Dubrovnik, these sort of places.
Yes, these sort of places. Italy itself was being invaded at the point of Sicily. So the question is, why did the king not intervene? And again, I think for the similar reason that the king did not intervene on so many occasions, which is that the king was not prepared to act against Mussolini unless he was basically sure that he would not incur any ill effects from doing so. And so it fell to Dino Grande to coalesce all of those forces against Mussolini and basically present the king a fait accompli. Essentially, Dino Grande waited until various elements in the army and the fascist movement, in particular de Bono, were dissatisfied, and then convened a assembly of the Grand Council of Fascism, which, as I mentioned, ironically, was created as a body meant to limit the king's authority, but in reality, it was barely used. And when it was used as a means to restore the king's authority. But
Indeed, to the point of, let's not forget, bringing alongside Ciano, who was
well,
Mussolini's.
I was about to mentioning Ciano, and
Son-in-law.
the reason I believe this was belated was actually because of Ciano, because Ciano was an avowed Republican, like, say, for
Hmm.
example, someone like Italo Balbo. I think Italo Balbo's death also plays into this, and the fact that Dino Grande was able to acquire more prestige because of the death of Balbo and the death of a great sort of fascist Republican.
Hmm.
But Ciano only became convinced of the cause against Mussolini. I think it was with the first bombing raid on Rome that he finally changed his mind. So had Ciano, say, for example, decided to betray Mussolini earlier, say, for example, in 1942, following the fall of Stalingrad or whatever, then
Hmm.
perhaps it could have happened before we see the loss of Libya, the loss of Tunisia following El Alamein, the capture of much of the Africa Corps, and then finally following that, the invasion of Sicily itself. And what I find interesting about that is that Italy waited too long, basically, again, to switch sides. As we mentioned with all of these previous examples in the history of monarchical Italy, Vittorio Emanuele III, when he decided to intervene in foreign policy matters, he decided to intervene in a way that almost caused Italy the most amount of suffering and anxiety. And this was no
Indeed.
exception. Had he decided basically to act on his own initiative, as he had done so in appointing Mussolini, say, for example, intervening in 1941 or 1942, Italy could have essentially retained its position as a power with some colonies, with most of its navy intact and most of its army. But in the situation that we see with the loss basically of Mussolini's authority, him being overturned by the Grand Council of Fascism, and the king being presented with a fait accompli, Italy was now faced with the situation of being invaded by both sides. Invaded by the Germans, who were in the middle of the Battle of Kursk, and the Italian and the Allies, the French and the British and the Americans. So the French, very small contingent, by the way, who had just invaded Sicily. And the king, in classic manner, decides to play both sides, appealing, I'm still fighting alongside the Germans while entering into armistice negotiations with the Allies. And the delay and him playing for time, all this does is basically allow for the Germans to organize for the operation to invade Italy using troops which are now being repurposed from the Battle of Kursk, which
Hmm.
basically ensures that the king will be removed from Rome. He will have to flee Rome. Mussolini will ultimately be rescued by Scorsese and placed in charge of a Italian counter-republic in the form of the Republic of Salo,
A
allowing
rump state
fascism,
in the north, yeah.
allowing fascism to have a sort of a necromantic afterlife.
Hmm.
And when the king finally does enter Rome alongside the allies, who he had the opportunity basically to invite earlier into Italy to ensure the Germans wouldn't reach Rome, he has no choice but to surrender his power to his son, to act
Hmm.
as lieutenant general of the kingdom, by which essentially the king has become a spent force. So I do find it remarkable again is that to say that the king is nothing more than just a sort of a passive actor in all of this is completely wrong. I think it's
Hmm.
fair to say that the king is a complete sort of continuity of all of his predecessors, and represents this constant vein, effectively, of duplicity, of changing sides whenever the opportunity essentially arose. But in the case of Mussolini, you can say he appointed him prematurely and fired him belatedly,
Yes, indeed.
which is rather remarkable.
And also, in terms of what you're saying about the king and his actions, it sort of is reminiscent of the idea that, that inaction is itself an action, like a non-choice is still a choice. And in many ways, how the king conducted himself in that respect is very much indicative of that. Is that, he's often seen, and I've even used I've even said it in the stream myself, that the Vittorio Emanuele did happen to at least come across as or present as a somewhat passive and, or in a decision making context, almost a lethargic man, but in other ways was quite vehemently encouraging of the particular course that Italy was taking. I think that's a very, very difficult thing to refute in
And
this context.
I think many people were incredibly frustrated with him during that period because effectively many people found it very convenient to disavow him because of his association with Mussolini. But the fact that the government that succeeded him included effectively many holdovers from Mussolini's government as well.
Hmm.
His main concern, his main concern was anti-communism, to ensure the survival of the
Correct.
dynasty and the survival of the social order, i.e., the consistent theme that we've elucidated throughout all of this. But the irony, of course, is in waiting too long, in preventing, in basically doing nothing to ensure the Italian army was ready to resist the German invasion in late of 1943. What that effectively ensured is that the Italian communist partisan movement became a huge political power broker in the north and was basically allowed to grow into what would basically become uh, Togliatti's party in
Hmm.
1948, which seemed at one point as if they could have gained power even legally in the
Yeah,
course of
absolutely.
Italy. In the course of
A- a-
Italy, it
yeah,
was actually the crisis of 1943 and the king's failed handling, and the fact that he was basically able to create the situation not to allow for a smooth transition of power from Mussolini back to the king, but in a way it empowered the communists in a way which was perhaps inconceivable at the time.
which if you consider the position which the partisans found themselves in 43, they were given all the raw material necessary to have built themselves a very sort of a very robust power base in a very short space of time, to the point where, Togliatti and the socialists in Italy were, by the late 40s and early 50s, you know a sufficient domestic force in Italy to have the Americans, the British, and what would become NATO quite concerned from a geostrategic point of view.
And I think this also reflects on Umberto as well, because Umberto had an impossible job. Another question is that, had Vittorio Emanuele decided to abdicate immediately, that could have again given the monarchy some sort of bolstering legitimacy. But it's the fact that he refused to abdicate, and then when he finally conceded power to Umberto in the form of the lieutenancy general, he did so again in a way that he believed his powers would ultimately revert back to him when the war was over. Um, it's this association that he purposely believed that Umberto II was not fit to rule. He did not give him the responsibilities and the education which was basically the accepted assumption among the princes of Piedmont, the crown princes of the Italian monarchy. And so And of course, Vittorio Emanuele was especially disparaging of his son, believing that he had no capabilities to rule. So, in the same way that Vittorio Emanuele was despising of his other relatives, like I mentioned, all the dukes of Aosta, Prince Emione, the King of Croatia, it seemed that not only was Vittorio Emanuele concerned with monopolizing the power of the House of Savoy, holding these residual powers, but believing he himself was the only one capable of it, and concerned that threats within his own family might hasten the demise of his dynasty. And that, as like I said, ironically leads to a situation where Umberto is hopelessly unprepared and compromised by the time he is belatedly given power and placed into that situation where we have the
Mm.
referendum.
And
And of
the
course,
very thing the king attempted to avert is what befell him ultimately.
even in spite of all that, the referendum was quite a narrow affair. The referendum that
Hmm.
declared Italy a republic in
Very
1946.
much, very much so.
And I would say again, had the king decided to act a bit more decisively in, say, for example, allying with Britain and the Americas first to basically allow them to occupy more territory against the Germans, that in itself would have meant that there would be far fewer people in the north who despise the Savoyard monarchy basically for allowing that situation to happen in the first place, because it was very much, if you look at the results, a north-south divide, and the vast
Hmm.
number of communist partisans who were able to win power in areas north as a result of guerrilla campaigns. So
Absolutely.
again, it's this question that had there had been, a tiny bit of better political calculation from the part of the king, even swaying the vote by 3 or 4%, and offering to abdicate earlier for the sake of Umberto, the Italian monarchy may have survived. So the irony,
Absolutely.
of course, in all of these things, which is obvious, the king, the whole purpose of the Italian monarchy, the Savoyard monarchy, seems to be to hold together a specific coalition for the sake of the monarchy's existence. And of course, Vittorio Emanuele ultimately loses everything and dies in exile in Egypt.
Yeah, exactly. And also too, just as another aside about the status of the referendum is that there was probably also degrees of, even though, as you rightly said, there's a strong north-south divide, obviously the north being rather anti-monarchist and the south being relatively pro-monarchist, is that there were people in the south as well who felt as if the war had come to their shores and their homes now, and that it was brought upon by the government, which on one hand was Mussolini and the fascists, and on another hand was the monarchy. And these two aspects of the Italian nation and its government acting hand in hand. And doubtless that would have had an impact, in the sense of the outcome of that referendum as well.
Figures also like Des Gaspare and, as I mentioned already, Croce were
Hmm.
more than willing to concede that the monarchy was a dead weight, and they were more than willing to build, the bedrock of their Christian democracy
Yeah,
sans the trappings of the monarchy as well. And simply in the case of the presidency simply sort of moves into the Coronial Palace as if it was always been there. And of course, I mentioned the irony of the fear of what Vittorio Emanuele represented at the beginning, the idea that he would abolish the monarchy to become its first Republican head.
mm,
Ultimately, that transpired as well.
indeed,
All right,
indeed.
I'm going to, unless you have anything else to say in conclusion, I'll just quickly go through the super chats and we can leave.
Uh, Not very much to say, but just other than that, again, on those sort of these shorter, slightly more sort of not esoteric, but strange, quirky sort of subjects that are wonderful canvassing with you, and it brings me much pleasure to do so. But as you can probably tell from my my speech impediment, I'm exceedingly tired. I do apologise to you and the audience. I've had a rather busy couple of days, so sorry for any errors on my part or any kind of slurring or mental blanks. My sincere apologies.
Well, I didn't notice any, and I'm very glad to have you here, as we
Indeed.
all, as are we all. Easterly Westerner for $20, thank you. A one-fold token of my manifold thanks for your soul-stirring work, AM, as well as Marcus, thank you. Alas, I can't watch live due to work. I have unanswered. And on theme, could the monarchy have won the vote in 46, or was it stacked? Um, like I said, it didn't help that so much of the ministers had already basically dispensed with the monarchy as a weight, and I think we've basically covered as to why it lost. I think had there been a situation where Vittorio Emanuele was able to position Italy better, where he didn't have to give up Rome and result in basically the American coalition-led coalition taking Rome back in June of 1944, and basically you can say that a large intercessor in ending the conflict was actually the Vatican as well. So it's actually this bizarre situation that the Vatican was spared and Pius XII basically emerged more so as the hero of the Roman population than the monarchy. So no, I think the monarchy did everything in its power to ensure its own demise by acting decisively in many ways where it shouldn't have acted at all and not acting when it should have. I think that's fair to say.
Indeed. There is a curious sort of part of this question where there's sort of accusations about being a state. And I think there probably was degrees of that gerrymandering occurring. But I tend to agree with AM that if the monarchy had acted with a little bit more expediency, it could have ensured its survival. But by the time the wars ended and 1946 comes around, the monarchy really couldn't have dug a deeper hole for themselves. And even though there was a very strong, and there actually has remained a strong monarchist sentiment within Italy, just given its association with, the fascists and how the war had panned out for Italy, it was always going to be a case of them pushing it uphill, so to speak.
Well, just to reference, I mean, basically, Mussolini is deposed in July of 43, and the Germans don't invade until September of that year. So there were essentially 6 weeks where the king had to organize forces to basically ensure the territorial integrity of Italy.
Hmm.
And it really seemed, if you look into the details up until the last minute, that the king was more concerned with the very wording of his armistice to figures like Eisenhower, so he could basically
Correct.
disabuse himself of any connection to it had he decided to flip and join the Germans at the last minute. So, like I
Uh,
said,
yeah.
ultimately,
Just
yeah.
sorry. You go. I'll add on to the end.
I was just saying, ultimately, again, he spent his entire life playing a duplicitous foreign policy, and ultimately it proved to
Mm.
be his undoing in a way.
I mean, and that's the thing too, and it's also in some ways exemplified by the reaction of a large number of Italian units and how they responded to the so-called changing of sides. Because there's a speech that's given, on behalf of the Allies. I believe Field Marshal Badoglio gave a. I can't remember if it was in uh, I can't remember where he actually made the broadcast. I got a feeling it was possibly somewhere in Sicily, where sort of they announced the collapse of Mussolini's government in Rome and the dismissal of the king, the Grand Council of Fascism, etc. And rather than there sort of being this cohesive, somewhat organized transition from one to the other, well, all through the Mediterranean, through the Greek islands, the Cyclades, and through in Crete and in places in Albania and occupied Greece, and even in parts of Italy, for instance, there are Italian units who flip straight to the Allies. There are Italian units who basically throw down their arms or are non-committal either which way. And then there were significant Italian forces that kept fighting alongside the Germans. Even on that basis alone, the Italians present a very disjointed, front regarding its own diplomatic stance vis-a-vis the Allies and the Axis. And I think that sort of goes to show, or it's another example there of Vittorio Emanuele rather worrying about the substantive, immediate proximal, um, you know, factors in his control. He's, dilly-dallying about the wording of his amidst the speech. And I think that sort of represents a lot of the frustrations that people would have had with the monarchy, both in retrospect and at the time.
Well, again, it's this question, as we see with the whole nature of dealing with foreign powers and also dealing with his choice of ministers post Mussolini. Bergoglio was chosen because he was a loyal military man. It was seen basically that would guarantee the loyalty of the Royal Army. But he himself was vilified by many of the allies because he was seen as, as the Duke of Addis Ababa. He was seen as, a butcher in Ethiopia
The
at a
terror of
single
Abyssinia, 'cause, I
terror of
mean,
Addis.
he's the one that basically certified the use of gas and whatever as well. So
Exactly. So he
mm,
was a poor choice from the point of view of actually appealing to make a coalition, because he was again seen as a someone who betrayed Mussolini and was banning all the fascist parties. So he was alienating them, but he was also alienating the Allies because of his military record. In the same way that having, say, for example, appointed someone like a Dino Grandi could have allowed some continuation between the new regime and the old regime. That would have perhaps allowed for many fascists to remain on side, but that would have further alienated the allies. So the king instead operated for a position of basically appointing fascist technocrats who were no longer technically associated with the fascist party to remain in place and fulfill those positions, which of course satisfied no one and seemed to basically act as a complete sort of counterintuitive when you're trying to build a coalition to replace Mussolini. Basically, all you're doing is succeeding him with the same functionaries they put in place, but you're simply changing the words in terms of their ultimate affiliation from fascist to monarchist. And if anything, that doomed the monarchy further because it seemed that there was that direct association with Vittorio Emanuele as the fascist king. Anyway, Cow Kudisatwin for 27 Canadian dollars. Thank you. Thank you for all the amazing content over the years. Truly a top tier channel. Obligatory question: what kind of music do you listen to? I'll ask that to Marcus first.
Oh gosh, I tend to have sort of eclectic taste in some ways, but yeah, kind of as one would typically expect. Do like classical music extensively. I've actually sort of done a bit of a circle back to even like traditional folk music from a European standpoint, and particularly like rediscovering like Italian stuff has been nice. I always find it hard to knock back the opera and that sort of stuff, but and also in a more modern sense, I kind of consider the '80s to be like the last gasp of Western music authenticity. So there's a bit of that, but yeah.
Well, you can't sort of be authentically Italian without enjoying a bit of Verdi, I suppose, especially due to
Indeed.
his connection to Italian unification, which we haven't mentioned.
Absolutely, absolutely.
As for myself, a very eclectic mix, sort of modern symphonic music, atmospheric music, jazz, late sort of classical music, Bruckner, sort of the more sort of elaborate symphonic pieces, that sort of thing. Yeah. Judge Clifford Bushman for €2. Good to see you back together again. Cheers. Well, thank you very much, Judge Clifford
Thank you,
Bushman.
sir.
Judge Caligula Bushman again for €6. Great topic. Good to see you boys together again. Too bad one man is missing. Cheers. Well, if you're referring to Columba hasn't been on this channel for nearly 3 years, but thank you very much, Judge Caligula Bushman.
We will have to somehow find the scrappy Scotty at some point.
I think he's trekking up the Amazon at the moment. Might be quite difficult.
Intrepid young man he is.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Anything you want to say, Marcus, before we get out of here?
No, not really, but other than to thank you all for sticking through it tonight, and also yes, indeed, for those who weren't here at the start of the show, my apologies for inadvertently causing a slight delay to proceedings tonight. But other than that, thank you very much, and thank you for the invite as always, Ian, and lovely to discuss a topic that actually to some degree is one I find A, fascinating, and B, as an Italian, I'm obviously Australian, but as an ethnic Italian, I do find great interest in, and has been an impactful one for anyone who existed or has family that had lived through Italy throughout the 20th century. There's no contesting with what one might call Italianita without the discussion of the Risorgimento, the monarchy, fascism, Mussolini. It's just such an intrinsic part of the modern story of the Italian nation and its people.
Oh, brilliant. Lovely to have you again here.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Good night.